Excuse my bad storytelling, my name is Luca, and this is a camping trip that actually happened. I was young at the time, around 11, and it was a school camping trip somewhere deep in the woods of northern Pennsylvania. The camp was old, built sometime in the early 1900s, and had that old, worn-down feeling. Wooden cabins with creaky floors, dim lighting, and the kind of damp air that clings to your skin even when it's warm outside. It was the kind of place that had history. The counselors told us that before it was a camp, it had been a logging outpost, then a hunting lodge, then abandoned for decades before being converted. They always told us those kinds of things like it was a fun fact, but I never really thought much about it until this trip. There were 6 of us sharing a room. Bunk beds lined against the walls, a couple of wooden dressers, and one empty bed that no one had taken. The first night, after the usual campfire stories and activities, we were messing around, talking about ghosts and trying to scare each other. We joked that we would try to talk to ghosts, just saying random things like, "If you're here, give us a sign," and all that dumb stuff kids do. Nothing happened at first, but when we turned in for the night, something felt off. That empty bed in the corner, it looked different. It had a shape in it like someone had been lying there. A faint imprint, like the weight of a small child had pressed into the mattress. We knew no one had been in it. We stared at it, freaked out, whispering about what it could be. That's when my friend, Jason, got up to go to the bathroom. He was nervous, but he laughed it off, saying we were all being stupid. He locked the door behind him. A few minutes later, we heard him screaming. Panicked, we ran to the door, banging on it, telling him to open up, but he kept yelling. The doorknob was rattling, shaking violently. Then we heard a metallic clink. The lock, one of those old turnstile locks, had fallen to the floor. Somehow it had come undone on its own. The handle was nearly coming off, barely hanging on by its screws. Jason stumbled out, pale, sweating. He swore something had touched him. Not just a brush, but a firm grip on his thigh, like fingers pressing into his skin. He lifted his shorts to show us, and I swear to God, there were red marks, almost like small handprints. That's when we noticed the mirror. It was fogged up, even though there was no hot water or steam. And on it, clear as day, was the imprint of a tiny hand. Not one of ours. It was too small, too perfect. We were just kids, but we knew something was wrong. None of us slept that night. The next morning, we tried to shake it off. We had a full day of activities: archery, hiking, canoeing. But the whole time, Jason and I kept noticing strange things. Our cabin's curtain moved at odd times, fluttering when there was no breeze. We could see it from outside while the rest of the camp was doing activities, and no one had been inside. That afternoon, we sneaked away from lunch, just a small group of us. We had to check the cabin. When we got inside, our stomachs dropped. The imprints were back, but now on every bed. It looked like a child had lain down on each one of them. Then we heard it, a sound, a scream, not loud but distant, like it came from inside the room but also far away at the same time. We bolted. No one even noticed we were gone. We blended back into the group, but we couldn't shake that feeling of being watched. We didn't want to talk about it anymore. On the final night, we had a campfire. We were all sitting around, listening to one of the counselors tell stories. It was the usual stuff, old tales about the woods, camp legends. But I wasn't really paying attention. I kept glancing toward the tree line, that dark stretch just beyond the light of the fire. And then I saw it, a figure barely visible standing near the river, still, watching. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, that it was just my imagination. But then the camp owner spoke up. He pointed toward the same area and casually mentioned something that made my blood run cold. Yeah, there were some drownings in that river way back when. People got caught in the currents. Dangerous spot. I stopped breathing for a second. I hadn't told anyone what I saw, and yet, there it was. The same spot, the same presence. I haven't gone camping since. The fire crackled in the middle of the campsite, sending up glowing embers that danced in the night air. The scent of burning would mixed with the greasy aroma of grilled hot dogs and marshmallows. It was a typical summer camping trip, something my family did every year. I was just a kid, probably 6 or 7. Too young to be aware of the dangers of the wild, but old enough to let my imagination run wild. My parents were there, along with my aunt and uncle and their kids. The day had been normal, hiking, fishing, and playing near the lake. But the night was something else entirely. It started with my uncle. He had always been the type to joke around, the type to push the limits of what was funny and what was just plain scary. As we all sat around the fire, bellies full, he decided it was time for a bedtime story. But not just any story, a song. His voice dropped to a whisper as he started singing in a slow, eerie tone. If you go down in the woods today, you're sure of a big surprise. If you go down in the woods today, you'd better go in disguise. His flashlight was pointed up at his face, casting deep shadows under his eyes, making him look almost inhuman. He reached out, scratching the bark of a nearby tree with his nails, dragging them slowly so the sound crawled up my spine. Then he swiped at the air, mimicking the motions of a bear. The song continued, each line growing more sinister in the darkness. The way he sang it made my stomach twist. The woods were pitch black beyond the fire's glow. No street lights, no distant city lights, just darkness, the kind that makes you feel small. I wanted to laugh it off like my cousins did, but I couldn't. Something about the way my uncle sang that song made my skin crawl. The words felt real, like a warning instead of a joke. When he finished, everyone clapped and laughed, but I sat there frozen. That night, when it was time to sleep, I was terrified. The tent was thin, just fabric separating me from whatever was out there. My dad must have noticed how scared I was because he put his hunting knife next to us in the tent. Just in case, he said. That should have made me feel safe. Didn't. Lying there in my sleeping bag, I couldn't stop hearing things. Every rustle in the leaves, every twig snapping. Then came the scratching. First, I thought it was my imagination, but it kept happening. A slow, deliberate scraping sound right outside the tent. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then I heard footsteps, slow, dragging steps that would move, then stop, then move again. I held my breath, straining to listen. Was it a raccoon? A deer? I wanted to believe that, but then the tent moved. Someone was pressing against the fabric, shifting it slightly. I nearly screamed. My mind went straight to the worst possibility. A bear sniffing around, waiting to tear through the tent. My body locked up in fear. I wanted to call out for my parents, but my voice wouldn't work. The zipper of the tent rattled. I thought that was it. This was how I died. But then my parents climbed in. I nearly jumped out of my skin. They told me to relax, that everything was fine. I tried. I really did. But I couldn't sleep. Not that night. Not the next one either. Every night, my uncle sang that song to me, dragging out the words, making them sound even worse. And every night, I stayed awake, heart pounding at every sound outside the tent. The days were normal, but the nights stretched on forever. I was sure that something out there was watching us. Years later, I was sleeping over at my uncle's house, staying in the basement. I was older by then, probably around 8, and I thought I was past all that fear. Then, right before bed, he started singing it again. That same slow, haunting voice. It sent me straight back to that camping trip. To those nights of lying awake, convinced something was outside the tent. I didn't sleep that night either. It took years for me to stop being afraid of camping. For a long time, just hearing that song made me tense up. But now I love camping. I love the woods, the mystery of it, the thrill. Maybe it's because I faced that fear so many times that it doesn't scare me anymore. Maybe I just grew up. But sometimes on quiet nights, when I'm deep in the woods and everything is still, I swear I can hear it again. That slow, dragging sound of something walking, then stopping, then walking again. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to get scared of anything. I grew up tough, strong, always the one people called when they needed help moving something heavy or handling a problem. But what happened to me in the fall of 2018 changed everything. It's been 6 years, and I still can't shake it. It all started when I went back to the property my father and I owned down in a small, quiet town in Kentucky. We used that land for everything: hunting, fishing, riding trails. But more than anything, it was a place my dad loved. When he passed, his one request was that his ashes be spread there, by the fire pit where we'd spent so many nights talking about life. I hadn't been back in a while, but something in me felt like it was time. I got down there late in the afternoon, pulling my truck up the long dirt path leading to our old campsite. The place was exactly how I left it, but the air felt different, heavier, colder, even though it wasn't the season for cold. I shook it off, blaming it on memories creeping in, and set up camp. I sat by the fire pit, where my dad's ashes rested in a metal urn. I talked to him like I always did when I visited, letting him know how things had been. But the entire time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I looked over my shoulder more than once, expecting to see a deer or maybe even a bear in the brush, but there was nothing, just the trees standing still in the dead air. The sun set faster than I expected, and as the last bit of daylight faded, I started feeling uneasy in a way I never had before. I had spent countless nights out here alone, and never once did I feel scared. But that night was different. I crawled into my truck around 8 p.m., locking the doors and cracking the windows just enough for some air. I planned to sleep for a few hours, then head back home the next afternoon. I wasn't worried about anything. I wasn't the type to get spooked. But then, just past midnight, I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. A slow, deliberate knocking on the window of my truck. My eyes snapped open, and for a second, I thought I had imagined it. The night was dead silent, not even the usual sound of crickets or owls. But then, tap, tap, tap. I turned my head toward the window, my heart pounding, and through the foggy glass, I saw something that made my stomach drop. My dad's urn. It was standing upright, right outside my truck, facing me. And somehow, taped or stuck to it was an old photo of him, the one we used at his funeral. It made no sense. I had just left the urn by the fire pit. I hadn't touched it since I got there. And now, somehow, it was standing outside my window like someone had placed it there. Deliberately. I froze. My brain tried to rationalize it, but there was no way. No wind, no animal. Nothing could have moved that urn from the fire pit to my truck. I reached for my flashlight, my hands shaking more than I wanted to admit, and shined it outside. Nothing. The urn was gone. I stepped out, gripping my knife in one hand, and did a slow circle around the truck. My breath was loud in my ears, and the whole time, that feeling of being watched only grew stronger. But there was nothing, just the trees, the fire pit, my empty campsite. I told myself I was seeing things, that I was tired, imagining shit that wasn't real. I locked the truck up again and forced myself to sleep. But sleep never really came. I kept waking up, feeling like something was outside, just out of sight. And then, around 3 a.m., I saw it. Through the windshield, just barely visible in the dim moonlight, there was a shape standing by the fire pit. Tall, too tall. At first, I thought it was a tree, but then it moved, slow, deliberate. And when it turned its head toward me, I saw its eyes wide, white, and empty, and its mouth, stretched into a grin too big for its face, filled with jagged, uneven teeth. I stopped breathing. It was watching me. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, staring back at it. My body was screaming at me to run, but I knew better. You don't turn your back on something like that. You don't give it a reason to move. Then, without warning, it took a step forward. The ground shook. It wasn't human. It wasn't even close. This thing was at least 20 feet tall, covered in veins and stretched, sinewy skin. I could hear it breathing, deep and ragged, like it had been waiting for me. And then, in a voice that made my blood run cold, it spoke. "It's me, son. You're dead." The words slithered out, wrong in every possible way. They weren't my dad's. They were something else, something trying to be him. I grabbed my keys, heart pounding, and turned the ignition. The truck roared to life and the thing flinched. For a split second, I thought about running it down, but something in my gut told me that wouldn't work. Instead, I did the only thing I could. I called my friend. 3 hours. That's how long it would take for him to get there. 3 hours of sitting in that truck, listening to the thing tap on my window, whispering my name. I didn't move. I didn't breathe more than I had to. And when my friend finally pulled up just before dawn, the thing was gone. We packed up and left without a word. The whole way home, I didn't speak. Neither did he. He could tell something was wrong, but he didn't ask. Maybe he saw something in my face. Maybe he just knew better. A few weeks later, I went to a diner near the property, just passing through, trying to make sense of what happened. That's when I overheard an older couple talking. They were whispering about something they had seen near their home. A tall, black figure with white eyes and a mouth too big for its face. The same thing, the same nightmare. I haven't gone back since. I never will, but it's not over. I still dream about it. I still hear the tapping sometimes when I'm alone, and I know deep down that it's still out there, waiting. Back in the summer of 1997, when I was 17, I went on a camping trip that I still can't fully process to this day. It wasn't supernatural, there were no ghosts or demons, but it was terrifying in the way that reality can be when things go wrong, and you realize just how small you are out in the middle of nowhere. I wasn't close friends with the people I went with. I knew them, kind of, but only in that way you know people you meet at parties or through friends of friends. They were all a little older than me, in their early 20s, and I think they only let me tag along because I was eager and didn't take up much space. Looking back, I doubt they really cared whether I was there or not. We drove way out into the middle of nowhere in northern Idaho. A spot that, according to one of the guys, had been used for hunting in the past but was mostly forgotten now. It was tucked deep into the woods, at the end of a long, barely visible dirt road that snaked its way through towering pines and thick undergrowth. There were no marked trails, no signs, no camp hosts, just raw, untouched wilderness. We planned to stay for 2 nights. The first night went fine. We drank, told stories, and sat around the fire until late. I felt a little out of place, but I kept quiet and tried to blend in. The second day, though, things started to go wrong. The guy who had driven us there, Alex, got into a fight with his girlfriend, Rachel. I wasn't paying much attention at first, but from what I picked up, he was convinced she was flirting with one of the other guys. Tension had been brewing between them all day, and by the afternoon, it boiled over into a full-on screaming match. At some point, Alex decided he'd had enough. He grabbed his stuff, stormed off toward his car, and before anyone could say anything, he drove away, leaving the rest of us standing there, stunned. At first, we assumed he'd cool off and come back. Maybe he'd just gone for a drive to clear his head. But as the hours passed and the sun started dipping behind the trees, it became clear that he wasn't coming back anytime soon. We were stranded. This was before everyone had cell phones. A couple of the older guys had them, but there was zero reception out there. No way to call anyone. We were at least 10 miles from anything remotely resembling a main road, and probably another 20 before we'd reach a town. We had no car, barely any food, and no clear plan on what to do next. That second night was uneasy. No one said much. We still believed Alex would come back in the morning. Maybe he just needed to sleep off his anger. So we huddled around the fire, quiet and on edge, listening to the distant sounds of the forest. Every crack of a branch, every rustling leaf made me jump. I wasn't the only one. The third day came, and there was still no sign of Alex. By then, our food was pretty much gone. We had some snacks left, but nothing substantial. And worse, we were running low on water. That's when panic really set in. We started debating whether we should try to walk to the main road or stay put. Some of the guys thought we should start hiking immediately, but Rachel and a couple of others argued that it was too risky. What if we got lost? What if Alex came back while we were gone? By the third night, things had shifted from mild panic to full-blown fear. We weren't just uncomfortable anymore, we were scared. I remember lying in my sleeping bag, staring at the roof of my tent, listening to my stomach growl, wondering what the hell we were going to do if no one came. The forest felt different that night, more alive. It wasn't just the usual nighttime sounds. There were noises, Snaps of branches, distant movements that felt closer than they should have been. I don't think any of us got much sleep. The next morning, we were all exhausted and desperate. We were just about to set out on foot when we heard something. An engine. A minivan pulled up to the site, and for a second, I thought it was Alex. But it wasn't. It was a family. A dad, mom, and their 2 kids looking to camp. They were as surprised to see us as we were to see them. After explaining our situation, they agreed to take a few of us to the nearest town, where we were finally able to call for help. A couple of hours later, friends of the group came to pick us up and get the rest of our gear. I never spoke to any of them again. I never saw Alex again. I don't know if he ever felt guilty about what he did, or if he just moved on, never thinking twice about the fact that he had left a group of people stranded in the middle of nowhere. I think about that trip sometimes, about how close we were to something going really, really wrong, about how easy it is for things to spiral out of control when you're cut off from the world. And most of all, I think about how lucky we were that someone showed up before it was too late. I was camping alone in a remote part of southeastern Kentucky, deep in the Daniel Boone National Forest. It was late October, the kind of cold that gets into your bones when the sun dips below the trees. The forest was thick, the kind of place where even moonlight had trouble finding its way to the ground. This was my 3rd and final night out here, and up until that moment, everything had been peaceful. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night, needing to take a piss. I was used to the sounds of the forest by now, the distant rustling of raccoons, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the steady creaking of trees in the wind. But as I unzipped my hammock and stepped onto the damp forest floor, something caught my eye. About 80, maybe 100 feet away, a headlamp flickered between the trees. I froze, watching. My heart pounded as I tried to process why anyone else would be out here at this hour. There were no official campsites nearby, and I hadn't seen another soul since I arrived. I stood there for a solid 10 minutes, barely breathing, just watching. The figure moved, standing up, sitting down. It was like they were waiting for something. A cold dread settled in my stomach. I wasn't alone out here. Slowly, I crept back to my hammock, slipping my boots on as quietly as I could. I reached for my hatchet, gripping it tight. My first instinct was to move, to get away from my sight and figure out what the hell was going on. Staying put felt like the worst possible option. I moved to the right of my campsite, keeping low. The damp earth muffled my steps as I maneuvered around trees, getting about 50 yards from my sight before angling towards the figure. I was trying to get a better look at what they were doing, why they were just standing there. That's when I saw it. Another headlamp. Closer. This one was only 40 feet away, bobbing slightly as its owner moved through the trees. Panic surged through me. 2 of them. I hit the ground and dragged a pile of leaves over myself, my breath shallow and controlled. The second figure walked closer, their boots crunching leaves, moving slow, deliberate. They got within 10 feet of me and stopped. My skin crawled as I watched them pull out a cigarette, lighting it with a faint crackle of the lighter. The smell of burning tobacco mixed with the damp earth. They stood there for what felt like an eternity, finishing their cigarette, crushing the butt under their boot. Then they tilted their head back and chugged the rest of their beer. The can hit the ground with a dull thud, rolling slightly before coming to a stop. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. After a while, they walked off, heading toward the first guy. I stayed put until I was sure I wouldn't be heard, then slowly rose and started moving toward the first man. I crept closer, careful with each step, until I was near enough to see the glow of his phone screen reflecting off his face. He was getting messages. Something about that made my stomach twist even more. Who was he talking to? The other guy? Someone else nearby? Then he stood up, and he started walking towards my campsite. I stayed on the ground, watching, waiting. My whole body was rigid as I listened to him moving, the soft crack of twigs breaking under his boots. I turned my head just slightly, my eyes following his movement. Then I heard it, my tarp rustling, then the clatter of my mess kit. More movement, flashlights flickering on and off, then voices low but urgent. He was just here. I didn't move, couldn't. My body felt locked, frozen in place as I listened to them tear my campsite apart. The sound of fabric ripping, metal scraping against rock, gear being tossed and stomped on. Then, after what felt like forever, their flashlights started moving away, bobbing through the trees until they were just tiny pinpricks of light in the darkness. I didn't sleep after that. I just laid there, heart hammering, fingers still clenched around my hatchet. When the first light of morning finally bled through the trees, I forced myself up. My knees were stiff, my body aching from staying in one position so long. I made my way back to my site, my stomach dropping at the sight. Everything was destroyed. My hammock was slashed to ribbons, the tarp above it shredded as if hacked at with a blade. My mess kit was crushed, my backpack completely gone. They even took my flashlight. I scanned the ground, looking for anything they might have left behind. In the spot where I first saw the guy, I found empty chew pouches, 8 crushed beer cans, and a lighter. In the second guy's area, I found cigarette butts, a torn-up plastic bag with powder residue inside, meth, and a pile of shit. No toilet paper. I was done. I grabbed what little was left of my gear and got the hell out of there. I didn't stop moving until I reached my truck, and even then, my hands were shaking as I turned the key in the ignition. I don't know who they were. I don't know if they were just drugged-up drifters or if they had worse intentions. But I do know this: I was being watched, hunted even. If I had made one wrong move, if they had caught me sneaking around, I don't think I'd be here to tell the story. That was the last time I ever camped alone. This happened when I was about 14 years old. I was in a scouting group, and we were on a weekend camping trip in the middle of nowhere. The location was a dry, rocky desert, mostly sand and scrub brush, with scattered boulders and a few sparse, twisted trees. The air was dry, and the sky was a deep, endless black at night, filled with more stars than I had ever seen before. There was no water nearby, no soft dirt, and no real cover beyond the scattered rocks and bushes. My friend Mark and I thought we would be cool and set up our tent a little farther from the rest of the group. We weren't too far, maybe 100 feet away, but it felt like a world apart in the dark. The other scouts and our troop leaders had all set their tents up close together near the campfire ring, the only real source of warmth and light in the otherwise empty desert. Our spot seemed like a good idea at the time. It gave us some space, and we figured it would be nice to have our own little corner away from the rest. We set up our tent on a relatively flat patch of sand between some rocks, the nearest bush maybe 20 feet away. As the night went on, we hung out with the rest of the troop around the fire, telling stories, roasting marshmallows, and enjoying the warmth. Eventually, one by one, the others started heading to their tents, and Mark and I decided to do the same. We turned off our flashlights, climbed into our sleeping bags, and tried to fall asleep. The desert night was colder than we had expected. The warmth of the fire seemed like a distant memory as the chill crept into our tent. The only sounds were the occasional murmur from the other scouts and the distant rustling of the wind over the sand and rocks. It was quiet, peaceful. Then we heard it. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, crunching in the gravelly sand nearby. At first, I thought it was one of the adults checking on us, making sure we were okay out here by ourselves. I whispered to Mark, asking if he heard it too. He did. The steps were slow, steady. They moved closer. We waited, listening. Then, just as suddenly as they started, they stopped. The silence was deafening. My heart pounded as I lay frozen, ears straining for any sound. Then we heard something even more unsettling, more footsteps. But these were different. They were lighter, quieter, still deliberate, still moving toward us. I swallowed hard and whispered, "Mr. Thompson?" No answer. I tried again, calling out the name of one of our troop leaders. Still nothing, just silence. We waited for what felt like forever, the quiet pressing in on us like a weight. Then, from the direction of the campfire, we heard a voice call back. One of the adults responding to our call. But they were way too far away. That didn't make sense. If they had been the one near our tent, there was no way they could have made it back to the campfire that fast without us hearing them walk away. The footsteps had stopped right near our tent, and we never heard them retreat. Mark and I looked at each other, wide-eyed in the dim light filtering through the thin fabric of the tent. My mouth was dry. My hands were shaking. Then, just as we started to convince ourselves it was nothing, the lighter footsteps returned. They moved closer again, slow but unmistakable. Couldn't breathe. Mark nudged me, whispering that we should check outside. I shook my head. No way. I wasn't about to poke my head out there and see whatever it was. Instead, we called for my older brother, Jake, who was back at the main campsite. At first, he just laughed it off, thinking we were trying to prank him. But when he heard the fear in our voices, he came up to check it out. The second he unzipped our tent and stepped inside, the footsteps stopped. He listened with us for a while, then shrugged and told us it was probably just an animal. But I knew he didn't believe that. He stayed with us for a few minutes anyway, probably to calm us down. Just as he was about to leave, the lighter footsteps returned, creeping closer. Jake quickly unzipped the tent and poked his head out. Nothing, just darkness, stars, and the faint glow of the campfire in the distance. No movement, no shadows, no sign of anything. He did it again and again, waiting until the footsteps got close, then jumping out to catch whatever was there. Each time, there was nothing. After a while, he shook his head and sighed. "It's just the wind or something," he muttered. But I could tell he wasn't convinced. He left us there, telling us to get some sleep. Mark and I stayed awake for a long time, listening. The heavy footsteps never came back, but the lighter ones did, off and on throughout the night. They never got as close as before. Eventually, exhaustion won and we fell asleep. The next morning, we looked for footprints in the sand. Nothing, just the marks from our own boots and a few scuffs that could have been anything. We asked the others if anyone had been messing with us, but nobody admitted to it. Nobody had any reason to. The younger scouts were all asleep early, and none of them were big enough to make the heavy footsteps we had heard at first. The adults swore they hadn't left the campfire area. We never did figure out what it was. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe it was a person from another campsite. But nothing about it made sense. The way the steps stopped and started, the way there were no tracks, the way we never heard anyone walk away. I don't know what it was, but I know what I heard, and I know I'll never camp that far from the others again. It was late September, that weird time of year where summer was officially over but fall hadn't fully settled in yet. The air was cool, but not cold, and the leaves were only just starting to change. My girlfriend, Lisa, and I had decided to go camping for the weekend. Nothing crazy, just a simple 2-night trip at a state park about 2 hours from home. It was a well-established campground, the kind with gravel driveways, designated fire pits, and a bathhouse within a short walk. There were plenty of other campers around, their tents and RVs spaced out across the sites, the warm glow of lanterns dotting the woods. We figured it would be an easy, relaxing trip. The first night was peaceful. We set up our tent, cooked dinner over the fire, and stayed up late talking under the stars. The sounds of the forest were familiar and comforting. Crickets chirping, the occasional hoot of an owl, the distant crackle of someone else's campfire. Eventually, we crawled into our sleeping bags and drifted off to sleep, lulled by the steady sounds of the night. The second night was different. I don't know what time it was when I first woke up, but the campsite had fallen completely silent. Even the crickets had stopped. Lisa was curled up next to me, breathing slow and steady. I almost rolled over and went back to sleep, but something felt off. I lay there, eyes open, ears straining to catch anything beyond the quiet. Then I heard it, a snuffling sound, slow, deliberate, right outside the tent. I held my breath, listening. It wasn't the rustling of leaves or the creaking of trees in the wind. This was something alive, something big. My first thought was a raccoon, but the way it moved didn't seem right. It was too heavy, its steps too solid. Then Lisa shifted against me. I felt her hand grip my arm tight. I turned my head slightly and saw her eyes open, wide with fear. She didn't say anything, just pressed herself against me and whispered, "Wake up!" I was already awake. The snuffling got louder, Whatever it was right up against the tent now, sniffing at the fabric. I could hear its breath. Deep, steady, wet. I clenched my jaw, trying to stay calm. My brain scrambled for answers. Black bear? It had to be. There were signs posted about bear safety near the entrance of the campground. But I didn't smell that musky, wild scent people always talk about. I had no idea what else it could be. I felt Lisa's fingernails digging into my arm as the nose pressed against the side of the tent. The material stretched inward, bowing under the pressure. My pulse pounded in my ears. If it was a bear, the usual advice was to make noise. Black bears scare easily. But it was the middle of the night, and there were dozens of other campers sleeping nearby. If I shouted and woke everyone up, that could cause a panic. The last thing I wanted was a half-asleep mob stumbling out of their tents into the dark, maybe spooking the animal in a dangerous way. But as I hesitated, the thing outside the tent did something worse. Pushed harder. The entire side of the tent warped. The pole on Lisa's side bent inward, creaking under the strain. The fabric stretched so much that I thought it might rip. I could see the vague outline of its snout pressing through, the shadow shifting as it moved. I needed to do something, fast. Without thinking, I reached for the flashlight next to my sleeping bag. My fingers closed around the plastic handle, and I flicked it on, pointing the beam straight at the bulging tent wall. The reaction was immediate. The creature went dead still, like it had been caught in a spotlight. A low, guttural grunt filled the air, deep and resonant, vibrating through my chest. Then, after a few seconds, it exhaled sharply and stepped back. The pressure against the tent disappeared. I didn't move. I kept the flashlight pointed at the same spot, waiting, listening. Then I heard it walk away. The steps were heavy, deliberate, crunching against the dry leaves. I counted each one, straining to track its movement. It wasn't running, but it wasn't lingering either. After what felt like an eternity, the sounds faded into the distance, swallowed by the forest. Lisa let out a shaky breath. I hadn't even realized she'd been holding it. Neither of us spoke for a long time. We just lay there, listening to the silence, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, I reached over and turned off the flashlight. The darkness swallowed us again. We didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At dawn, we unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The morning air was crisp, the sky a soft gray. Our fire pit was still intact, our food untouched. But the side of the tent, the one that had been pushed in, was warped and stretched, the fabric pulled tight in a way it wasn't supposed to be. I checked the ground. There were prints in the dirt, big ones, too big for a raccoon, too big for a coyote, definitely bigger than a dog. I didn't smell bear last night, but whatever had been outside our tent had been big. Bigger than I wanted to think about. Lisa and I didn't talk much as we packed up our things. We were both exhausted, running on a night of fear and adrenaline. We didn't even stay for breakfast. By the time the sun was fully up, we were in the car, heading home. We haven't been tent camping since. This happened when I was about 14 years old. I was in a scouting group, and we were on a weekend camping trip in the middle of nowhere. The location was a dry, rocky desert, mostly sand and scrub brush, with scattered boulders and a few sparse, twisted trees. The air was dry, and the sky was a deep, endless black at night, filled with more stars than I had ever seen before. There was no water nearby, no soft dirt, and no real cover beyond the scattered rocks and bushes. My friend Mark and I thought we would be cool and set up our tent a little farther from the rest of the group. We weren't too far, maybe 100 feet away, but it felt like a world apart in the dark. The other scouts and our troop leaders had all set their tents up close together near the campfire ring, the only real source of warmth and light in the otherwise empty desert. Our spot seemed like a good idea at the time. It gave us some space, and we figured it would be nice to have our own little corner away from the rest. We set up our tent on a relatively flat patch of sand between some rocks, the nearest bush maybe 20 feet away. As the night went on, we hung out with the rest of the troop around the fire, telling stories, roasting marshmallows, and enjoying the warmth. Eventually, one by one, the others started heading to their tents, and Mark and I decided to do the same. We turned off our flashlights, climbed into our sleeping bags, and tried to fall asleep. The desert night was colder than we had expected. The warmth of the fire seemed like a distant memory as the chill crept into our tent. The only sounds were the occasional murmur from the other scouts and the distant rustling of the wind over the sand and rocks. It was quiet, peaceful. Then we heard it. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, crunching in the gravelly sand nearby. At first, I thought it was one of the adults checking on us, making sure we were okay out here by ourselves. I whispered to Mark, asking if he heard it too. He did. The steps were slow, steady. They moved closer. We waited, listening. Then, just as suddenly as they started, they stopped. The silence was deafening. My heart pounded as I lay frozen, ears straining for any sound. Then we heard something even more unsettling, more footsteps. But these were different. They were lighter, quieter, still deliberate, still moving toward us. I swallowed hard and whispered, "Mr. Thompson?" No answer. I tried again, calling out the name of one of our troop leaders. Still nothing, just silence. We waited for what felt like forever, the quiet pressing in on us like a weight. Then, from the direction of the campfire, we heard a voice call back. One of the adults responding to our call. But they were way too far away. That didn't make sense. If they had been the one near our tent, there was no way they could have made it back to the campfire that fast without us hearing them walk away. The footsteps had stopped right near our tent, and we never heard them retreat. Mark and I looked at each other, wide-eyed in the dim light filtering through the thin fabric of the tent. My mouth was dry, my hands were shaking. Then, just as we started to convince ourselves it was nothing, the lighter footsteps returned. They moved closer again, slow but unmistakable. Couldn't breathe. Mark nudged me, whispering that we should check outside. I shook my head. No way. I wasn't about to poke my head out there and see whatever it was. Instead, we called for my older brother, Jake, who was back at the main campsite. At first, he just laughed it off, thinking we were trying to prank him. But when he heard the fear in our voices, he came up to check it out. The second he unzipped our tent and stepped inside, the footsteps stopped. He listened with us for a while, then shrugged and told us it was probably just an animal. But I knew he didn't believe that. He stayed with us for a few minutes anyway, probably to calm us down. Just as he was about to leave, the lighter footsteps returned, creeping closer. Jake quickly unzipped the tent and poked his head out. Nothing, just darkness, stars, and the faint glow of the campfire in the distance. No movement, no shadows, no sign of anything. He did it again and again, waiting until the footsteps got close, then jumping out to catch whatever was there. Each time, there was nothing. After a while, he shook his head and sighed. "It's just the wind or something," he muttered. But I could tell he wasn't convinced. He left us there, telling us to get some sleep. Mark and I stayed awake for a long time, listening. The heavy footsteps never came back, but the lighter ones did, off and on throughout the night. They never got as close as before. Eventually, exhaustion won and we fell asleep. The next morning, we looked for footprints in the sand. Nothing, just the marks from our own boots and a few scuffs that could have been anything. We asked the others if anyone had been messing with us, but nobody admitted to it. Nobody had any reason to. The younger scouts were all asleep early, and none of them were big enough to make the heavy footsteps we had heard at first. The adults swore they hadn't left the campfire area. We never did figure out what it was. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe it was a person from another campsite. But nothing about it made sense. The way the steps stopped and started, the way there were no tracks, the way we never heard anyone walk away. I don't know what it was, but I know what I heard. And I know I'll never camp that far from the others again. It was the winter of 2003, and I was deep in the woods of Montana, hunting with my buddy, Travis. We were staying at an old hunting shack owned by his uncle, miles away from the nearest town. The place was rustic, barely more than 4 walls and a roof, but it kept the wind off our backs. The plan was simple. Spend a few days tracking deer, bag something big, and head back to civilization with a cooler full of meat. That first day, we spent hours trekking through the snow-covered forest, rifles in hand, scanning for tracks. The cold bit through our jackets, and by sunset, we had nothing to show for our efforts. We made our way back to the shack, started a fire, and cracked open a few beers. Travis had brought a can of chili beans, and we ate them straight out of the pot, hunched over the stove like cavemen. It was a quiet night, just the sound of the wind pushing through the trees. Around 2 a.m., my stomach started making sounds no human stomach should ever make. The beans were doing their job, and I needed to take care of business. I pulled on my boots, grabbed my jacket, and took the old hunting stool we had been using as a makeshift toilet. I didn't bother with pants, just pulled my boxers up to my thighs and trudged about 20 yards out from the shack. The snow had started falling at some point in the night, just a light dusting, nothing too serious. I set the stool down, sat on it, and tried to make this quick. The cold was unbearable. My breath came out in thick clouds, and my thighs started to go numb. The silence was absolute, the kind of quiet that only deep winter can bring. The wind had died down, and all I could hear was my own breathing. Then I heard something else. A branch snapped, not from the wind, not from the settling snow. This was something stepping on it. The sound came from about 30 yards away, deep in the tree-line. I froze, mid-squat, heart hammering. My flashlight was a joke, barely strong enough to light up my own feet. I clicked it on anyway, shining it toward the noise. Nothing. Then another sound. Closer. The soft crunch of snow beneath something heavy. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint it. My hands went instinctively to the pocket of my jacket, fingers curling around the grip of my pistol. Then I heard the breathing. Slow, deep breaths. Heavy. Not human. Something big was out there. My body locked up, adrenaline dumping into my system. I gripped the pistol tighter than I'd ever gripped anything in my life, my finger just outside the trigger guard. Every time I heard another step, I whipped around, pointing the flashlight and pistol at the darkness. But I couldn't see a damn thing. It felt like an eternity. Sitting there, frozen on that stool, my body refusing to move, my mind screaming at me to get the hell out of there. But I was stuck, literally and figuratively. Then the steps stopped. The breathing stopped. I held my breath, waiting, ears straining. Nothing. After what felt like minutes, I finally got the courage to move. As fast as I could, I pulled up my boxers, grabbed the stool, and bolted for the shack. I barely remembered opening the door. I think I damn near kicked it in. Travis was still out cold, snoring away in his sleeping bag. I slid into mine, shivering, still gripping the pistol. My heart was still trying to punch its way out of my chest, but eventually, exhaustion won. I don't even remember falling asleep. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight cutting through the frost-covered window. I sat up, my body sore, my mind still half convinced I'd imagined the whole thing. But I knew what I had heard. I wasn't crazy. I pulled on my boots and stepped outside. The snow was fresh, crisp, untouched except for one thing: tracks. Big tracks. They led from the tree-line, circled around the spot where I had been, and then wandered back into the woods. My stomach dropped. I swallowed hard, following the prints with my eyes. A bear. A big one. Travis came out of the shack, rubbing his eyes. He followed my gaze, then saw the tracks. "Shit," he muttered. I just nodded. My mind replayed the night before. The breathing, the snapping branches, the feeling of being watched while I sat there, vulnerable. It had been right there, probably smelling me, wondering if I was worth the trouble. We didn't stick around much longer. Packed up our gear, loaded up the truck, and got the hell out of there. I've been hunting plenty of times since then, but I don't stray far from camp at night anymore. And I sure as hell don't eat chili beans in the middle of the woods. I was 27 when my buddy Mike and I decided to take on a long hike up in the Adirondacks, a trail that stretched about 50 miles. We had been planning it for months, excited to get away from everything for a few days. We both lived in Pennsylvania, and the drive up took longer than expected. Traffic, gas stops, and a wrong turn somewhere along the way. By the time we arrived at the trailhead, the sun was already low in the sky. We set off as quickly as we could, knowing we had a good few miles to cover before setting up camp. The woods were dense, the air damp with the smell of pine and earth. The occasional sound of running water told us we were close to a stream. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet you don't get back home. By the time we found our first campsite, it was getting late. The spot was about 20 feet off the trail, right next to a large stream. We could hear the water rushing over rocks, a steady, calming sound. Setting up camp was quick. We were both experienced enough to know what needed to be done. Mike had his tent, and I had my hammock strung up between two sturdy pines. We made a quick dinner, a small fire, and then called it a night. I remember lying in my hammock, feeling the gentle sway as I listened to the stream and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. An hour passed, maybe more. I was half asleep when I heard Mike say my name. It was low, urgent. I blinked, disoriented. The night was still except for the sound of the stream. "You hear that?" he whispered. "Something big's moving around." I listened, holding my breath. A few seconds passed, and then there it was. A crunch of leaves, a snap of a branch. Something was walking close to camp. My first thought was a deer, maybe even a bear. I cleared my throat and called out, letting whatever was out there know we were here. The noise stopped. Silence settled again. I closed my eyes. 10 minutes later, Mike called my name again. This time, there was a real edge to his voice. "It's still out there," I sighed, forcing myself up. The night was cold, and the ground felt damp through my socks as I stepped onto the earth. Mike was standing near his tent, his flashlight in hand. I grabbed my own, along with my headlamp, and started scanning the area. Nothing. The forest stretched out in darkness, the beam of my light catching glimpses of tree trunks and low brush. The air smelled of damp moss and wood. Then I noticed something strange. A bright light, farther up the trail, in the direction we had come from. At first, I assumed it was another campsite, maybe a big fire. But something about it felt off. It wasn't flickering like firelight should. It was steady, almost too bright. And we hadn't seen anyone else on the trail all day. Mike and I exchanged a glance. We stepped onto the trail to get a better look. The night was still, just the wind stirring the trees. No voices, no crackling fire, just that light glowing. I turned off my flashlight to see it better. The light started moving toward us. My stomach tightened. It wasn't a smooth movement. It was unsteady, almost like a drunk stumbling down the trail. I turned my light back on. The movement stopped. A chill ran down my spine. I turned it off again. The light moved forward once more. That same swaying motion, unnatural in a way I couldn't explain. My heart was hammering now. I could feel the adrenaline creeping in. Mike and I started yelling, hoping to get some kind of response. Nothing, just the wind. But the light, it kept shifting, kept creeping forward whenever we weren't looking directly at it. We bolted back to camp. Mike dug through his bag for his contacts while I grabbed my knife. It felt ridiculous, but I wasn't about to be unprepared for whatever this was. My hands were shaking as I clipped my knife to my belt. We stepped back onto the trail. The wind had died down now, and everything felt unnaturally quiet. That was when we finally saw it clearly. The full moon. It was high in the sky, its light shining through the gaps in the trees. The movement, just the wind shifting the branches, making it look like the light itself was coming toward us. We stood there for a long moment, breathing hard, adrenaline still pumping. I felt my face flush with embarrassment. Mike let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. We'd scared ourselves half to death over the damn moon. We didn't say much after that, just went back to camp, climbed into our sleeping bags and tried to calm down. I lay there in my hammock, staring up at the sky, listening to the stream, and feeling foolish. But the fear had been real in the moment. The way the light had seemed to move, the way the silence had settled around us, it had felt unnatural. The next morning, we packed up and kept moving. The rest of the hike was uneventful. Just miles of trail, good conversation, and the satisfaction of pushing ourselves. But that first night stuck with me. It's funny how the mind plays tricks on you, how something as simple as the moon can become something terrifying in the right circumstances. Years later, I still think about that night, and I still don't like the way the woods feel when the wind dies down and everything goes quiet. I remember that night like it was yesterday. My girlfriend and I had planned a weekend camping trip up near Pine Hollow Lake, tucked away in the Sierra Nevada mountains. It was 4th of July weekend, and though we had found a dispersed campsite away from the main grounds, we weren't alone out there. About 100 yards to the east, past a patch of thick pine and fir trees, there was another group, a younger American couple and a family that, from their accents, seemed Eastern European. The first night had been peaceful. We set up camp in a small clearing, our tent nestled against a fallen log, with our 2 dogs lying nearby. We cooked over the fire, watched the stars, and eventually drifted off to sleep to the sounds of the forest. But on the second night, things took a turn that I still have trouble believing actually happened. Started around 1 a.m. At first, it was just raised voices, distant but sharp enough to wake me up. Groggy, I sat up in my sleeping bag, ears straining to make out the words. My girlfriend stirred next to me. "What's that?" she murmured. I held up a hand for silence. The voices grew louder, arguing, yelling. A man's voice, rough and angry. Another, equally furious but accented. I shifted to unzip the tent and peek out, but before I could even move, something in the distance shattered the relative quiet of the woods. A metallic scrape, the sound of something being drawn, followed by hurried movement. Then came the gunshots. A sharp, ear-splitting crack echoed through the trees. Then another, and another. My body froze, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. My girlfriend gasped and grabbed my arm. The dogs, who had been sleeping just outside the tent, lifted their heads, ears pinned back. More shots rang out. Maybe a dozen, maybe more. I threw myself flat onto the ground, yanking my girlfriend down with me. I had no idea where the bullets were flying, whether they were just warning shots or wild and desperate. My only thought was to keep us unseen, unnoticed. I could hear shouting over the gunfire. The voices were frenzied now. Something about a machete, someone running, a metallic clatter, steel hitting dirt, a man yelling something unintelligible, his words blurred by adrenaline and fear. I swallowed hard, pressing my face against the cool fabric of the tent floor. My hands moved instinctively to the dogs, one hand on each of them, holding them still. They whined softly but didn't bark, as if they sensed how serious this was. For what felt like forever, I didn't move. I barely even breathed. The gunfire had stopped, but the tension in the air was still thick. I could hear movement, boots crunching over dried pine needles, hurried footsteps pacing. Then, a heavy thud, followed by a groan of pain. The voices were clearer now. The American guy was talking, his tone less aggressive than before, more desperate. I could make out words, something about leaving, about wanting his weapon back. The other man wasn't having it. He spoke in short, clipped sentences, his voice razor sharp. Then, more movement, a scuffle, a sound like someone being struck. Hard. Another groan, this one followed by a muffled curse. I could just imagine the scene playing out beyond the tree line. The American guy staggering, dazed, his head spinning from the blow. The foreign man standing over him, a gun still in hand, breathing hard. Then silence. I waited, ears straining. No more shouting, no more gunshots, just the sound of the wind rustling the branches above. A few minutes later, the crunch of tires on dirt. The American guy's girlfriend had started their car. The engine idled for a moment, then revved as she pulled up beside her boyfriend's crumpled form. I heard the sound of a door opening, then dragging, something heavy being hauled into the vehicle. A slam. The engine revved again. Then, just like that, they were gone, taillights vanishing into the night. I didn't move until I was sure they were far away. My whole body ached from how tense I'd been, and my head throbbed with the effort of keeping still. My girlfriend finally whispered, "What do we do?" I didn't know. Should we go check? Call the cops? There was no cell service out here, and hiking to the main road in the dark was out of the question. All I knew was that I wanted nothing to do with whatever had just happened. My gut told me to stay put, so we did. We laid there in silence for another hour, barely speaking, barely moving. My mind kept replaying the sounds, the images I had constructed in my head. The way the argument had escalated so quickly, the way a camping trip had turned into something straight out of a crime novel. Eventually, exhaustion took over. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was filtering through the fabric of the tent. I sat up slowly, muscles stiff, and listened. Nothing. No voices. No movement. Just the usual morning sounds of birds and rustling leaves. We unzipped the tent cautiously and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The dogs stretched and sniffed around, oblivious to the tension that still hung in my chest. There was no sign of anything unusual. No blood. No stray bullets lodged in nearby trees. No bodies. Just a quiet, empty forest. The other campsite, the one where the two groups had been, was vacant. The tents were still there, but there was no movement. No sign of the foreign man or his family. We didn't dare go any closer. We packed up our things as quickly as possible, throwing gear into the back of the car with shaking hands. As we drove away down the winding dirt road, I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror. I half expected to see someone standing there watching us go, but there was nothing. Just trees, just sky, just the echoes of what had happened the night before. We never went back to that spot. Never talked about it much after that either. But every 4th of July, I think about it. I think about the way violence can erupt out of nowhere, about how people can snap, about how close we had come to being part of something much worse. And most of all, I think about how, in the grand scheme of things, we were just lucky to make it out of there unnoticed. I remember the year well, 2015. It was early autumn, the kind of season where the air was crisp during the day but dropped to a biting chill at night. I had decided to take a solo camping trip to a remote site in South Dakota, not far from the Badlands. The place was a little-known campground, one that could hold about 30 people at full capacity. But that night, it was just me, completely alone. The wind had been relentless all day, howling through the valleys and rustling the dry grass. I was no amateur when it came to camping, but the wind was strong enough that I took extra precautions while setting up my tent, securing every guy line with precision. I wasn't usually so meticulous, but something in the back of my mind urged me to be careful. The site itself was in a wide open space, surrounded by low hills and stretches of grassland that swayed in the wind like an ocean. After a simple meal cooked over my small camp stove, I sat by the fire for a while, letting the heat soak into my bones. The sky was clear, and the moon was almost full, casting a pale glow over everything. There was something comforting about the solitude, yet at the same time, a sense of unease sat in my stomach. Maybe it was the wind, maybe it was the empty campground, or maybe it was the simple fact that we, as humans, aren't meant to be completely alone in the wild. Eventually, I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and let the exhaustion from the day settle over me. I fell into that deep, dreamless sleep that only comes after a day of fresh air and physical exertion. Sometime later, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. My brain was still sluggish from sleep, and for a moment, I thought it was just the wind outside. Then I heard it, a sound I knew well, a heavy stream of liquid hitting the dry ground. Cow pissing. That's what my brain first registered. I had grown up in dairy country, and I knew that sound as easily as I recognized my own breath. I sighed and was about to roll over, but then my mind caught up with my body. There were no cows here. This wasn't farmland. This was wild prairie. A slow wave of unease crept through me. Every instinct told me to move carefully. I reached out and unzipped the small window of my tent as silently as I could. The moon was still bright, illuminating the land around me. And then I saw them. Buffalo, an entire herd, at least 50 of them standing mere feet from my tent. Their massive, hulking bodies were bathed in silver light, their thick coats rippling with each gust of wind. Some stood still, others moved slowly, grazing, shifting. One of them, the one closest to me, was finishing up what had woken me in the first place. I froze, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. My tent was surrounded. There was no safe way out. If I startled them, if one of them got spooked and bolted, it could trigger a stampede. And with my guy lines stretched out around me, there was a very real chance that they could trip and bring my tent down on top of me. I stayed as still as possible, barely breathing. A part of me wanted to take a picture, to capture the sheer, unbelievable beauty of what I was witnessing. But the logical part of my brain shut that idea down immediately. The last thing I wanted was the sudden click of my phone disturbing the silence. For what felt like an eternity, I simply sat there, unmoving, watching. The buffalo were so close I could hear them breathing, the sound deep and steady. I could see the faint clouds of their breath in the cold night air. I had never been this close to them before. Not in the wild, not in the open like this. It was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Minutes passed, then an hour. Slowly, the herd began to drift, moving in a lazy, unhurried way to another part of the campsite. I kept my tent windows open, watching them go. The adrenaline that had gripped my body slowly began to ease. My limbs ached from being so tense, but I didn't move until the last of them had disappeared into the night. When I was finally alone again, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The silence that followed was almost deafening. The wind had died down, leaving the world eerily still. I lay back down, but sleep didn't come easily. My mind replayed the moment over and over, the sheer scale of those animals, their quiet presence, the delicate balance between safety and danger. It made me think about the people I cared about the moments we take for granted. For some reason, a song floated into my head, Pink Floyd's "Wish You Were Here." Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off again. When morning came, the first thing I did was step outside and look for tracks. They were everywhere, deep imprints in the dirt, proof that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. As I packed up my gear, I took one last look around the empty campsite. The wind had picked up again, rustling the grass, carrying with it a sense of something ancient, something wild. I had come here alone, but for one unforgettable night, I hadn't been alone at all. I drove away that morning with a strange sense of peace. The fear had been real, but so had the beauty, and that was something I wouldn't trade for anything. It was the fall of 2009 when my brother Luke and I decided to go camping deep in the woods of Tennessee. We had grown up hiking and camping, and we wanted something isolated, away from people. Luke had heard about a spot near the Natchez Trace, miles off the main road, a place where you wouldn't see another soul for days. Perfect, or so we thought. We packed up and drove out on a Friday morning, stopping in a small town for gas and some extra supplies. The guy at the counter, an older man with a grizzled beard, asked where we were headed. When we told him, he raised an eyebrow but didn't say much, just nodded and muttered, "Stay safe out there." We didn't think anything of it at the time. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful. We parked the truck at a small gravel lot, shouldered our packs, and started hiking. The woods were beautiful. Tall pines mixed with thick undergrowth, the occasional burst of autumn color. The trail was barely a trail, just an old logging road that had mostly been reclaimed by nature. After a few miles, we found a clearing near a stream and set up camp. It was perfect, far enough off the trail that we wouldn't be bothered, close enough to water, and surrounded by thick forest. That first night was peaceful. We built a fire, cooked some food, and talked about life. The sky was clear, the stars bright. Felt good to be out there, away from everything. The next day, we hiked further into the woods, exploring old logging paths and following the stream deeper into the wilderness. We found signs of old homesteads, broken foundations, rusted tools, the remnants of a life long abandoned. The sense of isolation was complete. As the sun started to dip, we made our way back to camp, exhausted but content. That night, things changed. We were sitting by the fire, drinking a couple of beers, when we heard something in the distance. At first, it was just a rustling, maybe a deer moving through the underbrush. Then we heard voices, low, indistinct, but definitely voices. We killed the fire and sat still, listening. The voices grew closer. We stayed silent, barely breathing. A few minutes later, we saw lights moving through the trees, flashlights sweeping the ground. 3, maybe 4 people. They weren't on the trail. They were cutting through the woods, moving with purpose. Then they stopped, not far from our camp, just beyond the trees. We could hear them whispering, but we couldn't make out the words. Then, just as suddenly as they appeared, the lights flicked off. We sat in complete darkness, the only sound our own breathing. The woods were silent, too silent. No insects, no owls, nothing. We didn't move. We didn't speak. We sat there for what felt like hours, waiting. Eventually, we heard movement again, footsteps retreating, then nothing. We didn't sleep that night. We didn't light the fire again. We just sat in the dark, listening. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first light crept through the trees, we packed up quickly. Neither of us said much. We just wanted to get out of there. As we were shouldering our packs, we heard something down by the stream. A dog barking, then voices, the same ones from the night before. They were close, too close. We took off, moving fast, not worrying about the trail, just putting distance between us and them. We made it back to the truck in record time, threw our gear in the back, and tore out of there. As we hit the main road, we saw a game warden's truck parked at the entrance to a side trail. A man in uniform stood by the truck, watching us as we drove past. For a brief second, I considered stopping, telling him what had happened. But something about the way he watched us, his expression unreadable, made me keep driving. To this day, I don't know who those men were or what they wanted. We never saw their faces, never heard their names. But I do know this, whatever they were doing out there in the middle of nowhere, they didn't want us there. And that thought still chills me to the bone. I had been planning this camping trip for months. A solo getaway, just me, my truck, and the wilderness. I picked a valley deep in the mountains, a place I had read about in some old hiking forums. Remote, isolated, perfect for disconnecting. No cell service, no nearby towns, just me and nature. I spent the first day hiking. The sun was setting by the time I was making my way back down the trail, and that's when I ran into him. A local guy, mid-50s maybe, built like he had spent his life outdoors. Seemed friendly enough. We talked about camping, the best spots, and he told me about a place just off the road, near the river. Said it was a little hidden, but a great spot. I followed his directions and found it easily. It was tucked away, just far enough from the road to not be obvious, but close enough that I could hear the occasional car pass. The river was nearby, its steady rush filling the air. The trees around the clearing made the spot feel secluded but not boxed in. I set up a small fire, cracked a beer, and put on my buddy's comedy podcast. I wasn't trying to be quiet. I laughed, cooked a simple dinner, and had a few more beers. Felt good being out there alone. I thought about setting up my tent but decided against it. It was already dark, and my truck bed was comfortable enough with the topper. Plus, I liked the idea of sleeping near all my gear. If anything went wrong, I'd be ready. I woke early, just as the sun was pushing through the trees. The air was crisp, the kind that makes you appreciate a hot drink. I got the fire going again, pulled another beer from the cooler, and started on breakfast. The smell of bacon filled the camp. That's when I saw him, at the edge of my camp, just standing there. A man. He looked like he had been out here for years. His beard was long and tangled, his clothes covered in tied-on plastic grocery bags. At least 100 of them, fluttering slightly when the wind picked up. I figured he was homeless, maybe a drifter. I didn't get up right away, just watched him from my seat by the fire. "Nice morning," I said, my voice casual. No response. I didn't feel threatened yet, but something felt off. I offered him some food. No reaction. He wasn't even looking at me, just kind of pacing, always keeping the same distance. Slow, aimless steps, but always within the boundary of my camp. I tried again. "You want a beer?" Nothing. He turned, his back to me now, still wandering in that slow, meandering way. That's when the unease turned into something heavier, something closer to fear. I wasn't stupid. I camped alone a lot. I knew when something was wrong. I shifted in my seat, letting my hand rest on the bear spray strapped to my hip. My knife was on the tailgate within reach. I let a few more seconds pass, waiting for him to do something, anything that made sense. He didn't. "All right," I said, my voice flat. "You either acknowledge me or you leave. Right now." Nothing. I stood, grabbing the bear spray as I took a step forward. My heart was hammering, but my body stayed steady. He didn't turn around, didn't react at all. I took another step. Then finally he moved. He walked away, slow at first, then faster as he disappeared into the trees. I didn't waste time. I threw my gear into the truck, barely bothering to pack properly. I kept my knife on my belt and the bear spray in my hand the whole time. Within minutes, I was on the road, driving faster than I should have on the winding mountain highway. The whole way home, I kept thinking about the night before, about how loud I was, how visible, how he could have been watching me for hours, maybe all night. I never went back to that valley, never even looked it up again, and I never slept outside my truck on solo trips after that. Sometimes I still think about him, about the plastic bags rustling as he paced, about how he never spoke, never looked at me, and I wonder what would have happened if I had been in my tent instead of my truck. When I was about 16 years old, my family had a tradition of camping at a state park in northern Wisconsin every summer. The place was familiar to me. I had spent so many nights there that I could probably walk some of the trails blindfolded. My best friend, Jake, always came with us. He had been camping with my family since we were little, and over time we had developed a routine. Every night, once the campfire had burned low and our parents were settled in their tents, Jake and I would go on a walk through the woods. We called it the ritual. There was something about walking through the silent forest in the middle of the night that felt both thrilling and peaceful. We had flashlights, but we barely used them, preferring to let our eyes adjust to the darkness. The crunch of leaves and twigs under our feet, the distant hoots of owls, and the rustling of nocturnal animals made it all feel like a world separate from the one we lived in during the day. That summer, we had decided to push the boundaries of our usual path. Instead of sticking to the familiar trails near the campsites, we wanted to venture deeper. The air was cool, and the scent of pine and damp earth surrounded us. The moon wasn't very bright that night, but we didn't mind. We knew the woods well. We walked for about 20 minutes, further than we had ever gone before. The light from the campground was completely gone now, and it was just us and the forest. We moved carefully, placing each step with precision to avoid tripping over roots and fallen branches. Then we heard it, a whisper, soft, barely audible, but definitely there. We froze. The sound had come from behind us. I clicked my flashlight on, spinning around. Nothing, just the trees swaying slightly in the night breeze. Jake turned on his light too, scanning the area. "Probably just the wind," he muttered. I nodded, but something about it didn't sit right with me. The sound hadn't been random, like wind filtering through the leaves. It had been deliberate, like a voice, but we saw nothing, so we kept moving. A few minutes later, we heard it again, closer this time, a whisper, just on the edge of comprehension, like someone was speaking but we couldn't quite catch the words. We stopped again, listening hard. Then, something moved in the underbrush. I snapped my flashlight toward the sound, expecting to see a raccoon or maybe a deer. Instead, my beam landed on something low to the ground. Person, a woman crawling. Her dark clothes were covered in dirt, and her hands scraped against the ground as she moved. She was whispering, random words tumbling from her mouth in a frantic, disjointed way. My breath caught in my throat. Jake took an instinctive step back. The woman lifted her head and looked right at us. She stopped crawling. Then, slowly, she pushed herself up to her feet. She was swaying slightly, her body unsteady. Her face was pale, streaked with dirt, and her eyes were wide, unfocused. "I'm looking for my campsite," she said. Her voice was rough, her words slurred. There was something off about her. She was disoriented, and the way she had been crawling. Why had she been crawling? We hesitated. Then Jake cleared his throat. Do you know where your campsite is? She shook her head. I don't. I was trying to find the bathroom. I glanced at Jake. Something was definitely wrong with her. She looked exhausted, like she had been out there for a long time. And if she was trying to find a bathroom, she had gone in the completely wrong direction. We didn't know what else to do, so we decided to walk her back to the campground. She stumbled a little as she followed us, her steps unsteady. The entire time, she kept whispering to herself, though the words were too quiet for me to make out. I tried not to let it get to me. Maybe she was in shock or just confused. Maybe she had been drinking. When we reached the campground, the atmosphere immediately felt different. The warm glow of lanterns and campfires, the distant sound of laughter from other campers. It was like stepping back into reality. We took her to the park ranger station, and as soon as we got there, it became obvious what had happened. The woman was extremely drunk or high, maybe both. She had wandered off, lost her sense of direction, and ended up deep in the woods. The ranger helped us locate her campsite. When we brought her back, her friends barely reacted. They had been drinking too and hadn't even noticed she was missing. One of them just laughed and said, "Oh, there you are," like she had just stepped away for a few minutes instead of crawling through the forest alone for who knows how long. Jake and I walked back to our own tent in silence. It was only when we lay down in our sleeping bags that the full weight of what had happened really hit us. If we hadn't gone that far into the woods that night, she would have been out there alone until morning. The thought made my skin crawl. I didn't know what would have happened to her. Maybe nothing. Maybe she would have eventually found her way back. Or maybe she would have wandered even deeper into the forest, too drunk and disoriented to find her way out. It wasn't a ghost story. It wasn't some horror movie creature stalking us through the woods. But somehow that made it even more unsettling, because it was real. I drove up the winding mountain road, the sound of gravel crunching beneath my tires the only thing breaking the heavy silence around me. The trees on either side of the road stood tall, their dense branches blocking out most of the fading daylight. I had left the city late, later than I had planned, and now I was racing the sun to get to the cabin before dark. The cabin belonged to my uncle. He had always talked about it like it was his escape from the world, a place where he could disappear and be left alone. I had never been there before, but when he offered it to me for the weekend, I didn't hesitate. I needed the break. Work had been grinding me down, and I was tired of staring at my phone all day, answering emails that never seemed to end. I just wanted quiet. The road stretched on, narrowing as it climbed higher into the woods. My headlights cut through the darkness now, illuminating the thick trunks of trees that crowded the edges of the road. When I finally saw the cabin, it almost blended into the woods around it, the dark wood of the structure making it look like part of the landscape. I pulled up in front and killed the engine. The quiet that followed was unsettling. No distant hum of cars, no voices, no city sounds, just the wind moving through the trees. The cabin was simple, a single-story structure with a slanted roof and a wraparound porch. There was a small shed out back, and beyond that, nothing but trees. I grabbed my bag from the car and made my way to the front door. The key was exactly where my uncle said it would be, under the mat. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of wood and dust. The cabin was cold, the kind of deep cold that settles into a place that's been empty for a while. I flipped on the lights, revealing a simple living space. A worn-out couch sat in front of a stone fireplace, and a wooden table with 2 chairs stood against the far wall. The kitchen was small but functional. There was one hallway leading to what I assumed were the bedrooms and bathroom. I walked through the cabin, checking the rooms. The bedroom had a single bed, a dresser, and a small window that looked out into the forest. The bathroom was basic, with an old mirror above the sink and a shower that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Everything was as expected, quiet, untouched, isolated. I set my bag down in the bedroom and returned to the living room. I wasn't hungry yet, and I didn't feel like starting a fire. I decided to step outside, breathe in the fresh air, and let my mind settle. The night was colder than I expected. The wind had picked up, and the trees swayed, their branches creaking. I stood on the porch, listening, but there was nothing else, just the wind. Still, I felt uneasy, like I was being watched. I shook it off and went back inside, locking the door behind me. The first night was restless. I kept waking up, every little sound making me sit up and listen. I told myself it was just the unfamiliar setting, the sounds of the woods, but something about the silence didn't feel right. It was too deep, too empty. In the morning, I decided to explore the area. I walked around the cabin, then ventured toward the tree line. The ground was uneven, covered in thick roots and fallen leaves. As I moved deeper into the woods, I noticed something strange. The trees were marked. Deep, rough gouges in the bark, too irregular to be from an animal. They looked like they had been made with something sharp, but not cleanly, like someone had hacked at them without a clear pattern. The farther I went, the worse the markings became. Some trees had entire chunks missing. The cuts were old, but not ancient. Maybe a few months, maybe a year. I stopped and looked around. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there. I turned back, moving quickly toward the cabin. The air felt heavier now, pressing down on me as I walked. When I finally stepped back onto the porch, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I locked the door behind me, feeling stupid for being so shaken. It was just trees, just markings, nothing to be scared of. That night, the noise started. It was subtle at first, a soft tapping sound, like something lightly hitting the side of the cabin. I sat up in bed, listening. The wind was still, the woods were silent, but the tapping continued. I got up and moved toward the window, peering out into the darkness. Nothing, just the trees standing motionless. I checked the door, making sure it was locked. Then, just as I was about to turn away, I heard it again. A soft scrape, this time near the back of the cabin. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and stepped outside. The night air was freezing, and the silence was suffocating. I shone the light around, scanning the area. Nothing. Then I saw them. Footprints in the dirt. They led from the tree line to the back of the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. They were fresh. I followed them with the light, my heart pounding. They stopped just beneath my bedroom window. I backed away slowly, then rushed inside, locking the door. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone. No signal. Of course, I barely slept. Every sound made me jump. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed my bag, grabbed my keys, and stepped onto the porch. The footprints were gone. The dirt had been disturbed, but there were no clear tracks anymore, like someone had deliberately wiped them away. I didn't wait to find out more. I got into my car and started it up, my eyes scanning the tree line. I expected to see something, someone, but there was nothing, just the woods, still and quiet. I drove away, not looking back. When I finally reached town, my phone buzzed back to life. I called my uncle and told him everything. He was quiet for a long time. Then he just said, "You did the right thing leaving." I didn't ask him what he meant. I didn't want to know. I had always wanted to get away from the noise. A weekend, or maybe longer, tucked away in a remote cabin where nothing but the sound of wind and trees would keep me company. No distractions, no people, just silence. So, when I found a secluded cabin up in the mountains online, I didn't think twice. It was cheap, which should have been my first warning, but I was too excited to care. I packed my car with enough supplies to last me a few days. Food, water, and the usual necessities. A few books, a journal, and some music for the rare moments I wanted to drown out the complete quiet. The cabin was a good 4-hour drive from the city, far enough to feel isolated, but not so far that I couldn't get back if anything went wrong. As I turned off the main road and onto the dirt path that led deeper into the woods, the trees closed in on either side, creating a canopy overhead. It felt like the world was shrinking around me, and I liked it. No one else in sight, just the occasional rustle of wildlife hiding out of view. I hadn't seen another car in miles. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, I couldn't help but smile. It wasn't much. Just a small, two-story structure with weathered wood and a porch that looked like it hadn't been used in years. But it was perfect in its own way. There was something charming about the peeling paint and the overgrown yard. It looked like it had been here for decades, untouched by time. A forgotten place. I grabbed my bags from the car and walked inside, the door creaking as I pushed it open. The smell of old wood and dust filled the air. The cabin was exactly what I imagined. A little rustic but cozy, with a stone fireplace and a big window looking out into the woods. I unpacked quickly, feeling the thrill of being alone in such a quiet place. Night came faster than I expected. I hadn't planned for the sun to set so soon, but once the dark settled in, the quiet felt almost heavier. The only sound was the wind brushing against the trees. The cabin felt like it was holding its breath, waiting. I didn't mind it at first. In fact, I was enjoying it. There was a kind of peace in the silence. But as the hours passed, I started to feel it. A nagging feeling. It wasn't fear, exactly, just a strange discomfort that crawled up the back of my neck. I chalked it up to the unfamiliarity of the place. It was a cabin in the middle of nowhere, after all. There were bound to be strange noises. But then, around midnight, I heard something that didn't sit right with me. It wasn't a noise that came from the house itself. It was outside. At first, it was faint, a rustling in the brush, like someone walking through the trees. I stood still, listening, but there was no sign of movement through the window. I brushed it off, but then the sound came again, closer this time. Heavy footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, like someone was carefully walking around the perimeter of the cabin. My heart started beating faster. I peered through the window, trying to see anything in the dark. There was nothing, just the wind and the trees swaying in the night. I told myself it was probably an animal, a bear or a deer, anything but a person. I wasn't ready to believe the worst. I decided to check the doors and windows, making sure they were locked, even though I knew they had been when I first arrived. Everything was secure, but the feeling in the pit of my stomach didn't go away. I tried to shake it off and went to bed, hoping sleep would calm my nerves. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling in the dark, I kept hearing those footsteps. They were moving around the cabin, circling it slowly. I tried to tell myself it was my mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I must have finally drifted off, because when I woke up the next morning, the sun was already up. For a moment, everything felt normal again. The cabin was quiet, peaceful, just like it had been when I first arrived. I made coffee and sat by the window, watching the birds in the trees, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Just my nerves getting the best of me. But when I went outside later, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Big, heavy prints in the dirt, leading from the edge of the trees right up to the porch. They were fresh, made just the night before, and they circled the cabin just like I'd heard. I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was someone who had gotten lost, looking for shelter. But why hadn't they knocked? Why had they been circling the cabin? I stayed inside the rest of the day, keeping a watchful eye on the woods. The thought of leaving crossed my mind, but I couldn't bring myself to drive back down that winding, isolated road at night. I knew I had to stay another night, but I couldn't shake the fear that something wasn't right. That night, the footsteps returned. They were louder this time, closer to the cabin. I could hear them scraping against the porch, like someone was dragging their feet. I stayed frozen, clutching the blanket around me, hoping they would stop. But the sound didn't fade. It grew louder, more deliberate, as if the person knew I was inside. They were waiting for me to do something, waiting for me to react. I stood up, heart pounding, and grabbed the flashlight from my bag. I crept toward the door, my fingers shaking as I turned the handle. I swung the door open and shone the light across the porch. But there was nothing there. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it. But then I saw something in the dirt, something that made my blood run cold. More footprints, but these weren't from the night before. These were fresh, and they led away from the cabin. I locked the door and sat on the couch, the flashlight still in my hand. I couldn't bring myself to sleep. I couldn't bring myself to leave either. The thought of driving back down that lonely road in the dark terrified me. I spent the rest of the night pacing, checking the windows, the doors, every so often hearing those slow footsteps outside. And every time I checked, there was nothing there. By morning, I knew I couldn't stay any longer. I packed up my things in a hurry, barely taking the time to make sure I hadn't left anything behind. As I stepped outside, I felt the weight of the cabin on my shoulders. It wasn't just the house that felt wrong. It was the whole place. The air felt thick, heavy, like it was holding on to something I couldn't see, but I could feel. I was almost to the car when I noticed something strange, something that made my stomach drop. There was a figure in the distance, standing just inside the tree line, watching me. I couldn't make out any features, but I could feel its eyes on me. I froze for a moment, unsure what to do. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared back into the woods. I didn't waste another second. I jumped into my car and drove off as fast as I could, not looking back. The further I got from that cabin, the lighter I felt, like something had been lifted from my chest. It wasn't until I was halfway back to civilization that I felt safe enough to breathe again. The terror had begun to fade, replaced by a sense of relief. But as I drove, I couldn't help but wonder, who had been out there, and why? I still don't know the answers, but there's one thing I do know for sure. I'll never go back to that cabin again. Some places, some situations are better left undisturbed. I had always imagined a cabin in the woods would be peaceful, a quiet retreat where I could finally escape the stress of everyday life and clear my head. So when I found a small, secluded cabin for rent, I thought it would be the perfect way to recharge. The cabin was nestled deep in the woods, far from the nearest town. The road leading up to it was narrow and barely maintained, with branches reaching out as if trying to pull the car off track. It took me longer to get there than I had planned, and by the time I arrived, the sun had already begun to dip behind the trees, leaving everything bathed in the soft golden light of dusk. The air was cool and crisp, the scent of pine thick in the air. The cabin itself looked like something out of a storybook. Wooden walls, a small porch with a rocking chair, and smoke curling out of the chimney. It was perfect, at least on the outside. Inside, it was simple but cozy, with a stone fireplace, a couple of chairs, and a small kitchen area. A small bookshelf sat in one corner, with a few dog-eared novels and old board games. I felt an odd sense of peace as I walked around the cabin, unpacking my things. The quiet was overwhelming, almost too much. The only sound was the occasional rustling of the trees outside and the chirp of distant crickets. It was the kind of silence that makes you more aware of the smallest sounds, like the creak of a floorboard or the soft shuffle of your feet on the hardwood floor. After settling in, I decided to take a walk around the area. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, the chill of the night air biting at my skin. The woods around the cabin were dense, with towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the dark. As I walked, I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me, like the woods were holding their breath. My flashlight flickered occasionally, casting long, eerie shadows across the path. But I shrugged it off. This was what I had come for, right? A little peace and quiet. I walked deeper into the woods, the ground soft beneath my boots, the air growing cooler with every step. The further I went, the more isolated I felt, like the world had slipped away, leaving only me and the trees. After a while, I started to feel like I was being watched. It was a strange feeling, a kind of pressure in the air, like something was just out of sight, waiting. I stopped for a moment and turned around, but there was nothing behind me, just the endless trees and shadows. Shaking off the feeling, I decided to head back to the cabin. The path back felt longer somehow, the trees seeming to close in around me. My flashlight flickered again, and this time I heard something, a faint rustling in the underbrush, almost like footsteps, but quick, too quick to be an animal. My heart started to race. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. but the rustling grew louder, closer. I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but I saw nothing. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead, and I quickened my pace, the flashlight bouncing erratically as I hurried back to the cabin. The feeling of being watched never left, and I couldn't shake the nagging sense that I wasn't alone. By the time I reached the cabin, I was breathing heavily, my pulse pounding in my ears. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it and bolting the windows. The night felt endless. The sound of the wind howling outside, the occasional creak of the cabin settling. It all made it impossible to relax. I sat by the fire, trying to calm my nerves, but the unease never left me. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was just on the other side of the darkness, waiting for me to fall asleep. But I couldn't sleep. I couldn't even think straight. The feeling of being watched only grew stronger, until it felt like the cabin itself was alive, breathing, waiting. I decided to check the windows again just to be sure. The wind was picking up, and the trees outside were swaying violently, casting long, twisted shadows across the snow-covered ground. The moonlight filtered through the trees, making the landscape look almost alien. As I peered out of the window, I saw something move in the distance. A figure, tall and thin, standing at the edge of the tree line. It was too far to make out clearly, but it was watching me, I was sure of it. My heart stopped. The figure didn't move, just stood there, perfectly still. I backed away from the window, my hands shaking. Was it just another trick of the shadows? Or had I really seen someone out there? I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy chair, and pushed it against the door. I didn't know why, but I needed to feel safe to make sure nothing could get in. My breath was coming in short, shallow bursts now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin was no longer my sanctuary, but a trap. The night stretched on like this, an endless cycle of fear and silence. I couldn't bring myself to go outside again, even though the sun was beginning to rise. The figure was gone, but the anxiety remained, gnawing at me. I kept my eyes glued to the windows, convinced that if I didn't watch, whatever it was out there would make its move. And yet, there was nothing. No sign of movement. The world outside was still, almost too still. As the day wore on, I decided to leave the cabin. I didn't care if it meant cutting my trip short. I needed to get out of there. I packed my things in a hurry, my hands moving quickly, almost frantically. When I stepped outside, I was relieved to see that the sun had come up, casting a warm light over the woods. For a brief moment, everything felt normal again, like the fear from the night before was just a bad dream. But as I made my way to the car, I saw something on the ground. Footprints, fresh ones, leading from the tree line to the porch of the cabin. I froze, my stomach dropping. The prints were too large to be mine, too far apart. Whoever had made them was far bigger than me, and the deep impressions in the snow told me they had been there for hours. The tracks led right up to the door I had locked, and I realized then just how vulnerable I had been. I didn't stick around to investigate further. My heart was hammering in my chest as I threw my bags into the car and sped down the narrow road. The trees seemed to close in around me again as I left, but this time I didn't look back. Couldn't. I didn't go back to that cabin. I don't think I ever will. I'm not sure what I saw out there or what kind of person or thing had been watching me that night. All I know is that I'll never forget the feeling of being trapped, of being alone in the woods with something out there in the dark, waiting. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it wasn't. But whatever it was, I won't ever forget it. The cabin is still up for rent. It's listed online, and the pictures still make it look so peaceful, like the perfect getaway. But every time I see it, I feel that same knot in my stomach. And maybe, just maybe, that's how it was meant to be all along. A place to make you feel safe, only to remind you that safety can be a lie. I drove up the narrow, winding road with both hands clenched on the wheel. The sun had already started setting behind the thick tree line, casting deep orange and red shadows over the road. I should have left earlier. The last thing I wanted was to be navigating these unfamiliar roads in the dark. The cabin was supposed to be about 20 miles off the main highway, but with the way the road twisted, it felt twice as long. When I finally pulled up, the cabin looked just like the pictures online. Small, plain, with dark wooden logs and a single porch light glowing in the early evening. The driveway was just packed dirt, surrounded by thick trees that made it feel more isolated than I expected. The nearest town was about 30 minutes away, and the idea of being alone for the weekend had seemed peaceful when I booked it. Now, looking at the dense woods pressing in around me, it just felt unsettling. I grabbed my bags from the trunk and made my way to the door. The key had been left under the mat, just like the rental instructions said. The cabin smelled like old wood and dust when I stepped inside. It had a small living room, a kitchen with outdated appliances, and a single bedroom down the hall. Everything looked clean enough, but it was clear no one had been here for a while. There was that stillness you only find in places left untouched. I locked the door behind me and checked the windows, making sure everything was secure. Not that I was expecting trouble, but I always had a habit of double-checking. The forest outside was so dense I couldn't see beyond a few feet in the darkness. Even with the porch light, the trees just swallowed everything beyond the small clearing the cabin sat in. It was the kind of dark that made you feel watched, even if you knew logically there was nothing out there. I turned on the old heater in the corner, listening as it clicked to life. It gave off a low hum, and the warm air was a welcome change from the chill that had settled in. I unpacked my bag, put some food in the fridge, and settled into the couch with a book. The first night passed without anything unusual, just the normal sounds of an old cabin, wood creaking as it settled, wind rustling through the trees outside. The second night, things started to feel off. I had spent most of the day hiking on the nearby trails, following a map that had been left in the cabin's drawer. The forest was beautiful, but something about it felt too quiet. No birds, no rustling in the underbrush, just the sound of my own footsteps crunching on the leaves. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself I was just overthinking things, but the unease stayed with me even after I got back to the cabin. That night, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first, just that something felt wrong. I lay still, listening. The heater was still humming. The trees outside were swaying in the wind. Then I heard it. Footsteps, not inside the cabin, but outside. Slow, deliberate steps crunching on the gravel of the driveway. I stayed completely still, heart hammering. Could have been an animal, I told myself. A deer maybe, or some other animal moving through the woods. But these footsteps weren't quick or random. They were steady, like someone was walking towards the cabin. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, but there was no service. I already knew that there hadn't been service since I turned off the highway. The only way to contact anyone would be to drive into town. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, waiting. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. I didn't dare move. After a while, I started to think I imagined it, that maybe I had been half dreaming. Just when I started to relax, there was a new sound. A light knock on the window. Not a hard knock, not loud. Just a soft tap, like someone barely brushing their knuckles against the glass. My stomach dropped. I hadn't left any lights on, so whoever was out there had to know someone was inside. I stayed frozen in bed, staring at the window. There were no curtains, just a clear pane of glass looking out into the darkness. But I couldn't see anything beyond the reflection of the room. I waited. Nothing happened. I don't know how long I lay there, barely breathing, before exhaustion finally won. When I woke up, it was morning, and the first thing I did was check outside. The ground was covered in fallen leaves, but the dirt in front of the window was disturbed. There were footprints, human ones. I packed my bag without thinking. I was done. I didn't care if I had rented the cabin for the whole weekend. Something about this place wasn't right. I grabbed my keys, stepped outside, and stopped cold. My car, all 4 tires were slashed. Not just punctured, completely shredded, as if someone had taken a knife to them. My heart pounded as I looked around. The forest was still, too still. The same unnatural silence from the day before. I had no choice. The town was about 15 miles away, mostly downhill. If I started walking now, I could make it before sunset. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed it with whatever food I could carry, and started walking. Every so often, I stopped and listened. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The trees felt like they were closing in, and the further I got from the cabin, the stronger the feeling became. I kept going, moving as fast as I could without running. Every so often, I'd hear something behind me. Branches snapping, leaves rustling. But every time I turned, there was nothing there. Then I saw it. Ahead, just off the trail, was an old, rusted truck. It looked like it had been there for years, half sunken into the ground. The windows were broken, and moss had started creeping over the hood. But what made me stop wasn't the truck itself. It was the cabin key sitting on the hood. My cabin key, the same one I had locked the door with that morning. I didn't think. I ran. I didn't stop until I saw the road, and when I finally did, I felt the panic catch up to me. I stood there, panting, looking back down the trail. I never saw anyone, never heard anyone behind me, but I knew, deep down, that I wasn't alone out there. A truck came by eventually, an old man behind the wheel. He slowed down when he saw me, asked if I needed help. I barely managed to tell him what happened, my throat dry, my hands shaking. He took one look at me and just nodded. "You're lucky," he said. "Most folks who come out of those woods alone don't make it this far." I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know. I just got in his truck and didn't look back. I never found out who was out there. Never knew if it was one person or more, if they had been watching me the whole time. But I never went back, and I never will. The moment I pulled into the long, gravel driveway leading up to the cabin, I felt something heavy in the air. It wasn't anything obvious. There were no immediate signs of danger. No strange noises, no shadows, nothing out of place. Yet, something felt wrong. I'd rented the cabin for a week, hoping for some peace and quiet away from the busy city life. After months of working from home, attending endless Zoom meetings, and constantly being surrounded by noise, I needed to disconnect. The cabin was tucked away in the middle of nowhere, the perfect spot to clear my head. I'd found it online, listed as a cozy, secluded place with all the amenities I could need. A small 2-bedroom house surrounded by dense woods, far enough from the nearest town to not be bothered. I got out of my car, stretched my legs, and took in the view. The woods seemed endless, thick with trees that blocked the view of anything beyond them. The air was fresh, crisp even. The silence was deeper than anything I was used to. No birds, no traffic, not even the usual rustle of animals. Just quiet. It felt odd, but I told myself it was probably just the remoteness of the place. I grabbed my bag from the trunk and made my way to the cabin's door. The wood was aged, with some parts of it chipped and worn. But that's what I expected from a secluded cabin. I wasn't looking for luxury. I just wanted solitude. I slid the key from my pocket, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The cabin had an old, musty smell to it, but nothing unbearable. It felt lived in, though. The kind of place you could imagine someone coming to after a long day of chopping firewood or hiking in the woods. A faded couch sat in front of a stone fireplace, with a few books scattered on the coffee table. The kitchen was small but functional, with a few items left behind: canned goods, some coffee mugs, and a dusty kettle. The first night went by without issue. I spent it unpacking, setting up my things, and making a simple dinner. The quiet was almost soothing. I enjoyed the silence, the way it made everything feel slower, more intentional. After dinner, I sat by the fire, reading a book. But even then, something kept tugging at me, a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. I checked the windows every so often, half expecting to see someone standing out there in the dark. But no one ever was. That night, I woke up to a noise. A scratching sound came from the walls. It was faint, almost like an animal trying to get in. I froze, listening. The sound was slow and methodical, like something or someone was moving around inside the walls. My heart started to race. I wasn't a coward, but this wasn't normal. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal. A squirrel, maybe, or a raccoon. The walls of the cabin were old, after all, and animals often found their way in through small cracks. I'd heard stories of people in cabins hearing things in the walls. It was unsettling, sure, but not something to worry about. At least that's what I told myself. Still, I couldn't go back to sleep. The scratching continued, sometimes faint, sometimes louder, but it never stopped. I got up and went to the kitchen, grabbed a flashlight, and walked around the cabin, trying to find the source of the sound. The walls seemed normal, no holes, no signs of damage, just old wood and stone. The rest of the night passed without incident, but the next day, the feeling of unease only grew stronger. I spent most of it outside, hiking the trails around the cabin. It was beautiful, and being out in the woods did help calm my nerves. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing just beyond the trees, but there was never anyone there, just the trees swaying in the breeze. By the third night, I had gotten used to the scratching. It was still there, but I had learned to ignore it, at least I thought I had. I was reading by the fire again when I heard something else. A thud, then another, followed by a dragging sound, came from upstairs. I stood up so quickly that I knocked over the chair. My heart hammered in my chest. I grabbed the flashlight again and slowly climbed the stairs, every step creaking beneath me. The upstairs was small, just 2 rooms, the master bedroom and a small guest room. I moved through them one by one, searching for the source of the sound. But everything was in place. The windows were shut, the furniture was where it should be. There was no sign of anything out of the ordinary, except for the faintest marks on the floor in the corner of the room. They were hard to see at first, just a few scratches, but the more I looked, the clearer they became. It looked like something had been dragged across the floor. The marks led to the far wall, where a small rug was rolled up, covering a trapdoor. I hadn't noticed it before. It was so well hidden beneath the rug that it blended seamlessly with the wood. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, my mind racing. Could it be some kind of cellar? Maybe an old storage area? Or was it something else? I knelt down and, with a trembling hand, lifted the rug. The trapdoor was old, the wood swollen with age, but it was still solid. I took a deep breath, grabbed the handle, and pulled. It creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. I stood frozen for a moment. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to walk away and forget I ever found this place. But curiosity, that deep, gnawing curiosity, pushed me forward. I grabbed the flashlight, pointed it toward the stairs, and descended slowly. The air down there was thick, musty, and cold. The space was small, just a single room with low ceilings. The walls were covered in dirt, and the floor was uneven. I walked through the room, shining the light on everything. Old crates and boxes were stacked in the corners, covered in dust. Nothing seemed unusual at first, but then I spotted something in the far corner, a large, old trunk. It was different from the others. It wasn't covered in dust, as if it had been opened recently. My hands shook as I walked over to it. I knelt down and slowly opened the trunk. Inside, there was nothing but a few tattered blankets and an old jacket. But when I reached in to pull out the jacket, I noticed something underneath it, a small, crumpled piece of paper. I unfolded it carefully. It was a map drawn hastily, with red circles marking certain locations in the woods. Some of the circles were near where the cabin was, others deeper into the forest. But one thing stood out to me. The map was old, much older than anything in the cabin. It didn't make sense. My heart started to race again. This wasn't just some old, forgotten cabin. Someone had been here recently. Someone who had left these strange marks, left this map. And I had a feeling they weren't far from here. I quickly stuffed the map into my pocket and headed back upstairs. I slammed the trapdoor shut, more out of fear than logic. I needed to leave. Now, I grabbed my things, packed up what little I'd unpacked, and rushed to the car. The sky was darkening, and the woods around the cabin seemed to close in on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, just beyond the trees. As I started the car and drove down the gravel road, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The cabin was still there, sitting in the dark, but now it felt like something more than just an abandoned building. It felt like a place that had secrets, dark ones, I don't know who had been in that cabin before me or what they had been doing, but I do know one thing. I will never go back there. And if you're ever looking for a cabin in the woods, make sure you check the walls. You never know what might be hiding inside them. The drive up to the cabin took longer than I expected. The last 20 miles were nothing but winding roads, cutting through thick forest on either side. My truck's headlights barely cut through the darkness, and the only other sign of life was the occasional deer darting back into the trees. It had been raining earlier in the day, and the damp road glistened under my headlights, making every turn feel uncertain. I kept my hands tight on the wheel, the tires crunching over gravel as I finally reached the clearing where the cabin sat. It was smaller than I remembered from the pictures online. Just a simple wooden structure, slightly leaning, with a narrow porch and one dim light by the door. The woods pressed in from all sides, tall pines stretching up, their branches swaying in the night breeze. I cut the engine, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then I heard the wind moving through the trees, a distant owl hooting somewhere far off. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat and made my way up the creaky steps. The key was where the owner said it would be, tucked beneath a loose board near the door. I slid it into the lock, twisting until it gave way with a reluctant click. The door groaned as I pushed it open, and the smell hit me immediately. The cabin smelled of damp wood, old dust, and something faintly metallic that I couldn't quite place. The inside was simple: a single-room layout, a small kitchen in one corner, a wood-burning stove in another, and a bed pushed against the far wall beneath a window. There was a second door leading to what I assumed was the bathroom. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old books, their spines cracked and faded. A single oil lamp sat on a wooden table near the bed, flickering faintly. I set my bag down and moved to the window. The glass was cold against my fingertips as I peered out. Darkness, just the reflection of my own face staring back at me, the faintest outline of trees swaying in the night. I shook off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine and turned to start a fire. The stove was old but functional, and soon enough, the warmth began to fill the small space. I sat down on the edge of the bed, listening to the wood crackle, the occasional pop breaking the silence. Something about the place felt off. It wasn't the usual fear of being alone in the woods. I'd spent plenty of nights camping in remote areas. This was different. It was like the cabin itself was watching me, the walls pressing in just a little too close. I pushed the thought away and pulled out my phone. No service. Not surprising. The owner mentioned that the nearest signal was miles away. I turned on my flashlight instead and took another look around the cabin. That's when I noticed the scratches. They were faint, running along the wooden floor near the door. At first, I thought they were just marks from moving furniture, but they were too deep, too deliberate. They ran in uneven patterns, some crossing over each other like something had been dragged, no clawed, against the wood. I swallowed, standing slowly. My eyes followed the marks up the doorframe, where they became less distinct but still visible. My breathing felt louder in the quiet. I moved back to the table, trying to shake the growing unease. It was an old cabin. Maybe animals had gotten in before, or maybe the wood had just worn down strangely over the years. I forced myself to focus on unpacking. A loud creak made me freeze. It had come from the porch. I stayed still, listening. The wind had picked up outside, branches swaying and scratching against the cabin's walls. But this had been different, more deliberate. Slowly, I reached for my flashlight and moved toward the door. I pressed my ear against the wood, holding my breath. Nothing, just the wind, just my imagination. I exhaled and shook my head, feeling ridiculous. I wasn't going to let an old cabin and a few scratches get to me. I locked the door, double-checking it before heading to bed. The night was restless. Every small noise outside made my eyes snap open. The trees creaked, the wind howled, and once, I swore I heard something moving just outside the window. I didn't look. I didn't want to look. I must have fallen asleep at some point because I woke up to the dim light of dawn creeping through the window. I sat up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, and immediately noticed something was wrong. The door was unlocked. I knew I had locked it, I had checked it twice, yet there it was, slightly ajar. A thin sliver of cold morning air creeping in. My stomach twisted as I stood, moving toward it cautiously. The floor felt colder than it should have, like the warmth from the fire had been sucked out. I pushed the door open and stepped onto the porch. The damp earth was undisturbed. No footprints, no signs of anyone having been there, but something had been inside. I could feel it. I didn't stay long enough to figure out what. I packed my bag in record time, tossing everything haphazardly into it before grabbing my keys and stepping outside. The morning light made the forest seem less menacing, but that feeling in my gut remained. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The cabin stood there, quiet, unchanged, but I knew something had been inside with me last night, and whatever it was, it had left before dawn. Or maybe it was still in there, waiting for the next person to come along. I should have turned back when I had the chance. The road had been bad from the start. A narrow strip of cracked asphalt that wound through endless miles of pine forest. But after the last gas station, it had only gotten worse. Potholes deep enough to swallow my tires, tree roots pushing through the pavement, and no sign of life except for the occasional rusted-out road sign leaning at an angle, covered in bullet holes. The cabin was supposed to be a quiet getaway. A week alone to clear my head, get away from work, and just breathe. I had found the listing online. Cheap, remote, right on the edge of a lake. It had seemed perfect. But now, as my car crawled along the unpaved path leading to it, every instinct in my body told me this was a mistake. When I finally saw the cabin, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It looked exactly like the pictures. A simple wooden structure with a wraparound porch, sitting just a few yards from the dark waters of the lake. The trees pressed in thick around it, but there was a small clearing, enough space for my car and a narrow footpath leading down to the dock. I killed the engine and got out. The air smelled damp, like wet leaves and old wood. The only sound was the distant creak of tree branches swaying in the wind. I walked up the porch steps, keys in hand, and hesitated before unlocking the door. The silence felt too heavy, like the woods were holding their breath. Inside, the air was stale. The living room was small, with an old couch and a fireplace that hadn't been used in years. The kitchen was basic, mini fridge, stovetop, a few dusty cabinets. A narrow hallway led to the bedroom and a tiny bathroom with water-stained walls. There were no personal touches, no signs that anyone had been here in a long time. The place felt abandoned, despite being listed as a rental. I set my bags down and checked my phone. No service. I had expected that, but it still made my stomach clench a little. I told myself it was fine. I had food, I had water, I had everything I needed. The first night was uneventful, but I didn't sleep well. The woods outside were too quiet. I kept waking up, convinced I had heard something moving outside, but every time I got up to check, there was nothing there. Just the trees swaying and the black, still water of the lake. The second day, I walked down to the dock. The water was murky, the kind that didn't let you see what was underneath. There was a rowboat tied to the dock, but the oars were missing. I thought about swimming, but the thought of putting my feet into that dark water made my stomach turn. I sat on the edge of the dock for a while, listening, but there were no birds, no fish jumping, nothing, just silence. That night I heard it again, a sound outside, like something moving through the leaves. I sat up in bed, straining my ears, but all I could hear was the soft creaking of the porch steps. My mouth went dry. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and moved to the window, but when I shined it outside, there was nothing, just empty porch and darkness beyond the trees. The sound had stopped. I barely slept after that. I kept the flashlight next to me, my ears tuned to every noise. The cabin felt too small, too exposed. There were too many windows, too many ways for someone or something to watch from the trees. The next morning, I walked around the cabin, checking for tracks, but the ground was hard-packed dirt, covered in pine needles. No footprints, but something had been there. I knew it. I wanted to leave, but I had come all this way, and I told myself I was being paranoid. I spent the day hiking, trying to shake the uneasy feeling. When I got back, the cabin looked exactly as I had left it, except for one thing. The front door was open. I knew I had locked it. My hands started to shake as I stepped inside. Nothing looked disturbed, but the door had been open, wide enough for someone to slip inside. I checked every room, every corner. Nothing was missing, but the air inside the cabin felt different, like it had been stirred up. That night, I locked the door and pushed the couch against it. I sat up with my flashlight, listening. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke up to a sound right outside the window. Slow, careful footsteps moving around the side of the cabin. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The sound stopped near the back door, and for a long time, there was nothing. Just silence. Then the doorknob rattled. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. I gripped the flashlight like a weapon, waiting, listening. The knob rattled again, harder this time. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I grabbed my keys and my bag, moving as quietly as I could. The door was still locked, but whatever was outside hadn't left. I could feel it there, just beyond the wood. I moved to the front door and slowly pushed the couch aside. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the keys. I unlocked the door and yanked it open. The porch was empty. The woods were empty. I ran to my car, threw my bag inside, and got in. My hands fumbled with the ignition, and the engine groaned to life. As my headlights swept across the trees, I thought I saw something, a figure, just at the edge of the woods. I didn't stop to look. I slammed my foot on the gas, tearing down the narrow road, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. I drove until I hit the main highway, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I didn't stop until I was miles away, parked outside a gas station, hands still shaking as I gripped the wheel. I don't know who or what was out there. Maybe it was just some drifter, maybe it was something worse. But I know one thing for sure. I will never go back to that place, and I'll never stay in a cabin alone again. The road to the cabin was nothing but a narrow dirt path cutting through miles of dense forest. The farther I drove, the worse it got. Rocks crunching under the tires, tree branches scraping the sides of my truck. It had rained earlier, and the mud was thick, making the truck slide slightly if I wasn't careful. I had rented the cabin for a weekend, a break from everything. No emails, no calls, no people. Just me, the woods, and the sound of nothing. It was supposed to be peaceful. The cabin itself was old. Not the charming kind of old you see in travel brochures, but the kind that looked like it had been standing too long. It was all wood, darkened by years of weather, and had a slanted roof that sagged slightly in the middle. The windows were small, and the glass had a dull yellow tint. The front door was heavy and stiff when I pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale, the kind of smell that comes from a place left empty for too long. Dust coated the wooden floor. A fireplace took up most of one wall, and a pile of logs sat next to it, gray and dry. The furniture was simple, a wooden table, 2 chairs, a couch that looked like it belonged in the 70s. A single lamp stood in the corner, its shade covered in cobwebs. I set my bag down and walked through the cabin. There was a small kitchen, the counter scratched and stained. A narrow hallway led to a bedroom with a single bed and a thin mattress. The sheets were stiff, and when I pulled them back, a few dead bugs scattered underneath. The bathroom was the worst. The mirror above the sink was warped, the toilet stained, and the shower head covered in rust. I told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't here for comfort. Just a couple of nights, then I'd be back to normal life. The first night it rained, hard. The sound of it against the roof was steady, but every so often, the wind howled through the trees, making the walls creak. I sat by the fireplace, the fire small and weak, and read a book I had brought. The lamp flickered once, then twice before holding steady. The power in a place like this wasn't reliable, but I had flashlights if I needed them. At some point, I heard something outside, a thud, like something heavy dropping onto the porch. I put the book down and listened, just the rain, the wind, then another sound, a slow, deliberate creak, like weight shifting on old wooden planks. I stood up and moved toward the window, careful to stay in the shadows. I peered out, but the porch was empty, just the rain running in streams off the roof. Maybe a branch had fallen. Maybe the wood was just settling. I told myself it was nothing, but my nerves stayed tight long after the noise stopped. The next morning, I found something strange. Footprints. They started at the edge of the trees and led toward the cabin, stopping right at the front steps. They weren't boot prints or shoe prints. Bare feet. The mud had preserved them well. Long, narrow feet with toes that dug deep into the ground, as if whoever made them had been moving slow, pressing down hard. I looked around, but the woods were still. The footprints didn't go back the way they had come. They just stopped at my porch. I spent the day hiking, trying to shake the feeling. It didn't work. Even deep in the woods, I kept turning, expecting to see something behind me. Every snapped twig made me jump. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was low. I checked around the porch again, but the footprints had started to fade in the drying mud. Still, I locked the door behind me. I pushed one of the chairs under the doorknob. Felt stupid, but it made me feel better. That night, the noise came back. A creak on the porch, then another, then silence. I sat in bed, holding my breath, listening. A slow, dragging sound against the wood. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped into the main room. The fire had died down, and the air was cold. I aimed the light at the door. Through the gap at the bottom, I could see shadows shifting. Someone was out there. I moved to the window, keeping low, and lifted the corner of the curtain. First, I saw nothing. Just the darkness, the outline of trees. Then movement. A shape just beyond the porch, standing too still. I didn't breathe. The shape moved, slowly stepping forward, into the light from the window. It was a man, but something was wrong. He was too thin, his skin too pale, stretched too tight over his bones. His eyes were dark hollows. He wasn't wearing a shirt, just tattered pants that hung off his frame. He lifted his head, sniffing the air. I stepped back, my pulse hammering. He took another step and then another. His bare feet made no sound against the ground. I didn't wait. I grabbed my bag, yanked the door open, and ran. The truck was parked down the path, too far, but I ran anyway, crashing through the trees, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my grip. Behind me, I heard movement, fast, uneven steps. I didn't look back. I reached the truck, my hands shaking so bad I fumbled with the keys. I dropped them, cursed, scrambled in the mud. A sound came from the trees, a low, rasping breath. Close, too close. I found the keys, wrenched the door open, and threw myself inside. I locked the doors, started the engine, and hit the gas so hard the tires spun in the mud before catching. In the rearview mirror, I saw him step onto the road, just standing there watching. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove through the night, back to town, back to people, back to lights and voices and safety. I never went back to that cabin. I never told anyone what I saw. But sometimes, late at night, I dream about that road, the trees pressing in, the footprints in the mud, and those dark, hollow eyes watching from the edge of the woods. I drove up the winding dirt road, the tires of my truck kicking up dust in the dimming light. The sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the forest. I hadn't seen another car for over an hour, and my phone signal had disappeared miles back. The isolation was something I had been looking forward to. A full weekend away from everything. No work, no calls, no distractions. Just me, the woods, and the quiet. The cabin was exactly how I had left it last year. A simple wooden structure, slightly weathered, sitting in a small clearing surrounded by towering pine trees. I parked the truck, grabbed my bag from the back seat, and made my way up the short set of creaking wooden steps. The key was still hidden under the loose plank on the porch, just like always. The door groaned as I pushed it open. Inside, everything was as expected. The small living space smelled of old wood and dust. The furniture was covered in sheets, and the fireplace was cold. I set my bag down, peeled the sheets off the couch and chairs, and went to check the kitchen. The cabinet still had some canned food I had left behind, and the water ran clean when I tested the tap. Satisfied, I returned to the truck to grab the rest of my supplies. Some fresh food, a case of beer, and my rifle, just in case. By the time I had everything inside, the last light of the day had vanished, leaving only the deep blue of early night. I locked the door out of habit, even though I knew no one would be out here. The nearest town was miles away. I started a fire in the fireplace, the crackling flames sending flickering shadows dancing across the walls. I took a seat on the couch, cracked open a beer, and let out a deep breath. The silence was perfect, but then I heard it, a faint sound, just outside. At first, I thought it was the wind rustling through the trees, but it was too deliberate, too steady. Footsteps, slow and careful. I sat completely still, listening. It was close, maybe just beyond the porch. I turned my head towards the window, but the glass only reflected the firelight inside. I stood up slowly, setting my beer down without a sound. The footsteps stopped. I grabbed the rifle, stepping lightly across the wooden floor, careful not to let the boards creak. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. I reached the door and pressed my ear against it, holding my breath. Nothing. Just the distant hoot of an owl. I waited a few minutes, then slowly unlatched the door and pushed it open an inch, peeking outside. The porch was empty. The trees swayed gently in the night breeze. Maybe it was just my imagination, or an animal passing through. Still, I couldn't shake the unease creeping up my spine. I locked the door again, checked the windows, then sat back down. I forced myself to relax, taking slow sips of my beer. The fire burned lower. The only sound was the occasional pop of the logs. My body finally started to unwind. I stretched out on the couch, letting my eyes close. Then the footsteps returned. This time they were faster, moving around the cabin, circling. I shot up, grabbing the rifle, my heart hammering. The firelight flickered, casting shifting shadows across the walls. I moved to the nearest window, trying to see through the darkness. Nothing but trees and the faint outline of my truck. The footsteps stopped again. Then 3 loud knocks on the front door. My breath caught in my throat. I gripped the rifle tighter. Who the hell would be out here? I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Another 3 knocks. Slow, heavy. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. My truck was right outside, but if I made a run for it, whoever was out there could easily catch me before I started the engine. The rifle was loaded, but I didn't want to fire blindly through the door. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the knocking stopped. Minutes passed. Nothing. I took a shaky breath and moved towards the door again. I pressed my ear against it, listening. Stillness. I exhaled and took a step back, my fingers numb around the rifle. A creak, but not from the door, from the back of the cabin. My stomach clenched. Someone was inside. I turned, scanning the room, my pulse roaring in my ears. I hadn't heard the back door open, but I hadn't checked if it was locked either. A shadow shifted near the kitchen. My grip tightened on the rifle. The fire cast just enough light for me to see the shape of someone standing in the doorway to the hall, completely still. My mouth went dry. The figure didn't move, didn't breathe, just stood there. I raised the rifle, my hands trembling. "Get the hell out," I managed, my voice low and raw. No response. I blinked, and in that split second, the figure was gone. My breath came in ragged gasps. I forced my feet to move, stepping cautiously towards the hall. The darkness stretched ahead, swallowing everything past the fire's glow. The back door was open, just slightly. I slammed it shut and locked it. My hands were shaking. I turned every light on in the cabin, checked every room, every corner, every closet. Nothing. No footprints inside. No broken windows. No sign that anyone had ever been there. But I knew what I saw. I barely slept that night. The rifle never left my grip. Every tiny noise made my skin crawl. By morning, I had made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my things in record time, threw them in the truck, and didn't bother to clean up. As I turned onto the dirt road, I glanced at the cabin in the rearview mirror. The front door was still shut, the porch empty. Just an old, lonely cabin in the woods. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching me, and I knew I would never come back. I don't know where to start. I guess I should say that I'm lucky to be alive, but it doesn't feel that way. I haven't slept more than an hour or two at a time since it happened. My body still tenses up at every little sound. I can't be in the dark anymore. It was supposed to be a weekend to clear my head. I had been working too much, barely getting any time to myself. My friend suggested I go somewhere quiet, somewhere without cell service, just to get away from everything. I found an old cabin online. It was in the middle of nowhere, up in the mountains, hours away from the nearest town. The owner rented it out cheap, said it was the perfect place to reconnect with nature. I packed light, just some clothes, food, a sleeping bag, and a flashlight. The drive was long, but the scenery was beautiful. Winding roads, dense forests, and not a single car in sight for miles. When I finally reached the cabin, I felt a strange sense of isolation. It wasn't fear at first, just an awareness of how alone I was. The cabin itself was small, old, but sturdy. The walls were thick logs, the windows tiny. There was no electricity, just an old wood-burning stove and a few oil lamps. The air smelled of damp wood and dust. There were no signs of recent visitors, no footprints, no fresh wood in the pile outside. The first night was uneventful. I made a fire, cooked some canned food, and read by lantern light. The silence was overwhelming at times. No cars, no voices, just the occasional creak of the trees outside. When I finally went to bed, I remember thinking how dark it was. I had never experienced darkness like that before. Absolute swallowing. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound outside. It was soft at first, like something moving through the leaves. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe, but then I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. I stayed completely still, listening. The footsteps stopped. The cabin was small, and from where I lay, I could see both doors. They were shut, locked. I reached for my flashlight, careful not to make a sound. I clicked it on and aimed it at the window. Nothing, just darkness. The forest beyond the glass was a solid black wall. I barely slept after that. Every little noise made my pulse jump. The wind, the trees creaking, distant rustling. I told myself it was my imagination. The next morning, I found tracks outside. They weren't boot prints, just vague impressions in the dirt. Barefoot, human. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. They led from the trees toward the cabin and then stopped. No return trail. I packed my things, ready to leave. I had come here for peace, but I wasn't going to stick around if there was someone else out here. The problem was I had no signal. I hadn't had any since before I got to the cabin. The drive back down the mountain was long, and I had a sinking feeling the whole way. It wasn't until I reached the nearest town that I felt like I could breathe again. I stopped at a gas station, went inside, and asked the clerk if he knew anything about the cabin. He gave me a strange look. "You stayed up there?" he asked. I nodded. "By yourself?" I nodded again. He shook his head. "Man, that place has been empty for years. Owner died a long time ago. No one rents it out." I didn't argue. I just left. I didn't want to know anymore. Since then, I haven't gone anywhere alone. I haven't told anyone the full story either. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, I wake up thinking I hear footsteps outside my window again. Slow, deliberate, listening. I don't know why I thought staying in a cabin alone would be a good idea. Maybe it was the stress of work, the endless noise of the city, or just a need to prove something to myself. Either way, I found myself driving up a winding road through dense trees. The sun starting to dip behind the hills as I followed the GPS directions deeper into nowhere. The rental listing had called it a peaceful retreat. But as the last bit of cell service faded from my phone, I started feeling uneasy. The cabin was small, old, and clearly had been standing there for years. The wood was faded, The porch steps creaked under my weight, and the windows looked like they hadn't been cleaned in months. I reminded myself that this was what I wanted: silence, solitude, an escape. The key was under a loose board on the porch, just like the owner had said in the email. I picked it up, dusted off a few dead leaves, and unlocked the heavy wooden door. The hinges groaned as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale, like it had been shut up for too long. The furniture was old but solid, the kind of stuff built to last, with thick wooden beams overhead and a stone fireplace against one wall. A small kitchen sat off to the side, with an old gas stove and a fridge that hummed loudly when I plugged it in. There was a single bedroom in the back and a tiny bathroom with a rust-stained sink. It wasn't fancy, but it was enough. I set my bag down and started checking the place out, flipping on light switches and opening windows. The electricity worked, though the lights flickered once before settling. The water ran, but it was brown at first, and I had to let it run for a while before it cleared up. I made a mental note not to drink from the tap. The only clock in the cabin was on the wall above the fireplace, an old wooden thing with black hands that ticked loudly in the silence. As night settled in, the quiet became heavier. In the city, there was always noise, cars, sirens, people. But here, there was just the wind in the trees and the occasional creak from the cabin settling. I turned on the small radio in the kitchen, but it only picked up static. I shut it off and sat down with a book, trying to ignore the strange feeling creeping into my stomach. It was just nerves. I wasn't used to this kind of isolation. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. The bedroom was cold, so I threw an extra blanket over the bed and climbed in. The mattress was stiff, and the pillow smelled slightly musty. I closed my eyes, listening to the wind outside. Then I heard something else. It was faint, almost hidden beneath the sound of the wind. A soft, rhythmic tapping. I held my breath and listened. It was coming from the front porch. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding. Probably just a branch, I told myself. Maybe an animal. But something about it felt off. It was too steady, too deliberate. I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand and crept out of bed, moving as quietly as I could. The tapping stopped as I reached the front door. I stood there, holding my breath, waiting. Nothing. After a minute, I finally worked up the nerve to open the door. The porch was empty. The wind stirred the trees, and the night air was colder than I expected. I shone the flashlight around, checking the steps, the railing, the space under the porch. Nothing. I locked the door and went back to bed, forcing myself to ignore the way my skin crawled. I must have drifted off at some point because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to the sound of something moving outside. Not just moving, scraping. A long, slow drag against the wooden walls of the cabin. I sat up, my pulse hammering in my throat. The sound came from the side of the cabin, near the kitchen window. I forced myself to move, slipping out of bed and grabbing the flashlight again. I inched toward the window and peeked through the curtain. The beam of my flashlight caught movement just beyond the trees. Something dark, just at the edge of where the light could reach. I couldn't make out a shape, just the impression of something retreating into the woods. I stayed up the rest of the night, listening. The noises didn't come back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. In the morning, I went outside to check the walls. There were deep scratches in the wood, long and uneven, like something had dragged claws or a knife along the surface. My stomach turned. I told myself it had to be an animal, a bear maybe, or a raccoon. But I'd seen the way that thing moved last night, and it hadn't moved like an animal. I wanted to leave, but I told myself I was being paranoid. I had 2 more nights booked, and I wasn't going to let my imagination ruin this trip. I spent the day hiking, trying to shake the unease. By the time I got back, I felt a little better. I built a fire in the fireplace, made myself a sandwich, and tried to enjoy the quiet. Then, just after sunset, the noises started again. First, it was footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving just beyond the edge of the trees. Then came the scratching, this time at the back of the cabin, near the bedroom window. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a fireplace poker, and stood near the front door, my heart hammering. Then I heard the doorknob rattle. I didn't think. I just moved. I grabbed my keys and yanked open the door, ready to run for my car. But the porch was empty. The woods were empty. Nothing but trees and shadows. I slammed the door and locked it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold onto the poker. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in a chair by the door, waiting, listening. By morning, I knew I had to leave. I packed my bag in record time, barely stopping to breathe. As I stepped outside, my stomach dropped. There were footprints in the dirt, leading from the woods to my porch. Not animal tracks, bare feet. I didn't stop to think. I jumped in my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled away, I looked in the rearview mirror, scanning the trees. That's when I saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the tree line, watching me. Too tall, too thin. Not moving, just watching. I didn't stop. I didn't breathe. I just kept driving, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. I didn't look back again. I had been driving for hours. The sun was gone, swallowed by the thick canopy of trees, and the road had become a narrow, winding path barely wide enough for my truck. The cabin was supposed to be somewhere around here, deep in the woods, isolated, just how I wanted it. A weekend alone, away from everything. No noise, no people, just me and the quiet. The directions had been simple, but I had already missed a turn at some point. My phone lost signal over an hour ago, and my gas tank was lower than I'd like it to be. I had to find the place soon. Then, finally, my headlights caught the shape of the cabin through the trees. It was smaller than I expected, just a single story, and the wood looked old, nearly gray in the beams of my lights. I pulled into the small clearing beside it, the gravel crunching under my tires, and killed the engine. Everything went silent. I stepped out, the cold hitting me instantly. The air smelled damp, like wet leaves and old wood. I grabbed my bag from the back seat and climbed the porch steps. The key was under the third plank, just like the owner had said. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The inside was as simple as I expected. Wooden walls, an old couch, a fireplace, a tiny kitchen tucked into the corner, and a hallway leading to what I assumed was the bedroom and bathroom. I set my bag down and locked the door behind me. It felt good to be away from everything. I checked my phone again. No signal. I hadn't expected any out here, but it still made me uneasy. There was a landline on the wall near the kitchen, but when I lifted the receiver, there was nothing. Dead. Probably hadn't worked in years. I spent the next hour unpacking, lighting the fireplace, and settling in. There was no TV, no radio. Just me, the crackling fire, and the sound of the wind outside. I sat on the couch, staring into the flames, letting my mind slow down. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to silence. The fire had burned low, just a few glowing embers left. I rubbed my eyes and stood, stretching. Then I heard it, a sound outside. It was faint, but it was there. A shuffle, maybe footsteps. I froze, listening. The wind had picked up, rattling the branches outside, making it hard to tell if what I heard was real or just my imagination. Then it came again. Not the wind, not an animal. Something moving just beyond the porch. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and stepped toward the front door. I hesitated, then switched off the inside lights before I cracked the door open just enough to peek out. The porch was empty. The trees stood still, dark shapes against the night sky. But the feeling was there. Something was off. I closed the door and locked it. Maybe it had been a deer or a raccoon. I told myself that, but my gut felt tight. I double-checked the windows. Locked. I added more wood to the fire, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. I sat back down, stared at the flames, listened. Then I heard it again. Closer this time. It wasn't footsteps. It was breathing. Slow, steady, just outside the window to my left. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My heart pounded in my ears. I turned my head just enough to see the window out of the corner of my eye. Nothing. But I knew I wasn't alone. I stood up slowly, moving to the kitchen. I had brought a hunting knife just in case, but now I wished I had something more. A gun. Anything. I gripped the handle of the knife and moved toward the hallway. If someone was out there, watching, waiting, I needed to be smart. I made sure the bedroom and bathroom windows were locked. I checked the back door. Locked. Then I turned off the last light and sat in the dark, waiting. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Nothing. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. I tried to sleep but couldn't. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind. Then, around 3 in the morning, I heard it again. Not outside. Inside. A creak. A shift in the wood, somewhere near the front door. My grip tightened around the knife. My truck keys were on the counter, too far to grab without making noise. The floor was old. Every step I took would give me away. I had no choice but to wait. Then I saw it. A shadow moving in the faint glow of the dying fire. Slow, deliberate. I held my breath. The front door was still locked. The windows were still locked. But someone was inside. I knew I had to act. If I stayed frozen, they would find me. I gripped the knife tighter, forced myself to breathe silently. The shadow moved again, closer now. I could hear their breathing, steady, controlled. They weren't searching. They knew where I was. I had to move. In one motion, I lunged forward, slashing out with the knife. I didn't feel it connect, but I heard a sharp breath, a reaction. I ran, barreling toward the front door, fumbling with the lock. The moment I wrenched it open, I felt something move behind me. I didn't turn around. I ran to my truck, yanked the door open, and locked it behind me. My hands shook as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and my headlights flared, illuminating the porch. Empty. No movement. No shadow. Just the cabin, standing there like nothing had happened. I threw the truck into reverse, tires spinning in the gravel. I didn't stop, didn't breathe until I was back on the main road, miles away. I didn't call the police. What would I even say? There was no proof, no damage, nothing missing. Just a feeling, a shadow, a presence that shouldn't have been there. I never went back, and I never stayed anywhere that isolated again. I don't know why I agreed to stay there alone. Maybe it was pride, or maybe I just wanted some peace away from everything. The cabin was a few miles into the woods, far from any neighbors. It belonged to my uncle, who used it for hunting trips, but he hadn't been there in years. He told me the door might be a little stiff, and the generator was old but working. That was all I knew about the place before I got there. The drive up was long. The roads were rough, unpaved, barely wide enough for my truck. The deeper I went into the woods, the more I felt like I was leaving the world behind. No streetlights, no houses, just trees stretching endlessly on both sides. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked smaller than I had imagined. The wood was dark from years of rain, the roof slanted just a little too much on one side. The front porch had a single wooden chair and a stack of firewood against the wall. It looked old but sturdy enough. I stepped out of the truck, grabbing my bag from the passenger seat. The air smelled damp, like moss and wet leaves. It was quiet, too quiet. Even in deep woods, you usually hear something. Birds, wind moving through trees. But here, it felt like everything was holding its breath. I ignored it, shaking off the unease. The front door was exactly like my uncle had warned, stiff and rough to push open. The inside smelled musty, the air thick with dust and old wood. There wasn't much inside, just a small kitchen area, a couch that had seen better days, and a bedroom in the back. The windows were covered with thick curtains that barely let any light in. Felt cramped, but I wasn't here for comfort. Just a weekend alone, away from everything. I started with the generator. It was in the shed behind the cabin, covered in cobwebs. I pulled the cord a few times before it sputtered to life, sending a low hum through the air. The lights inside flickered on, dim and yellow, barely making a difference in the gloom. But at least I had power. I spent the next hour settling in, unpacking my food and setting up the old fireplace. The chimney must have been clogged because the smoke lingered a little too long before finally escaping up. I didn't think much of it. The unease from earlier was still there, a quiet discomfort, but I told myself it was just the isolation. Then I heard it, a sound outside, faint but clear, a crunch like something stepping on dry leaves. I froze, listening. Nothing. I walked to the window, pushing the curtain aside just enough to peek out. The woods were dark, endless, and still. Maybe an animal. A deer, maybe. I let the curtain fall back and stepped away. I didn't sleep well that night. Every sound felt too sharp. Every creak of the cabin's wooden frame made my skin crawl. But I kept telling myself it was nothing. Just the woods, just my mind playing tricks. The next morning, I stepped outside to get some fresh air. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. They started near the tree line and led toward the cabin, stopping just a few feet from the front porch. They were deep, the dirt packed down from weight. Someone had been there, standing, watching. I swallowed the rising panic. Maybe a hunter, maybe someone lost. I tried to tell myself that, but the tracks didn't lead away. They only came toward the cabin. No return footprints, like whoever it was had walked up and then just disappeared. I spent the day pretending I wasn't shaken. I checked my phone, no signal. I wasn't surprised, but it still made me feel cut off. I kept myself busy, chopping wood, making sure the generator still had enough fuel. By the time the sun started to set, I felt more in control. I locked the doors, made sure the rifle above the fireplace was loaded, and settled in for another night. Then, just as I was dozing off, I heard it again, this time closer. A slow, deliberate step on the wooden porch. Then another. I held my breath. The rifle was within reach, but my hands felt frozen. Another step, then silence. I forced myself to move, grabbing the rifle and creeping toward the front door. The handle was locked, but that didn't stop the unease crawling up my spine. I raised the rifle, exhaled, then ripped the door open. Nothing, just darkness, just trees stretching into more trees. I stepped out, the cold biting through my clothes. I shined my flashlight around, the beam cutting through the night. The footprints from earlier were still there, but now there were more. A fresh set, leading to the door. I felt something in my chest tighten. I wasn't alone out here. Someone was watching. Someone had been standing on my porch, close enough to touch the door. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping the rifle, my back against the wall. I didn't hear anything else, but I felt it. That heavy, suffocating feeling of being watched. As soon as the sun came up, I made a decision. I packed my things, threw everything in the truck, and left. The road back felt longer, every shadow in the trees stretching too far, moving just out of sight. I didn't stop, didn't look back. When I finally reached town, I told my uncle what had happened. He frowned, listening, then sighed. "You're not the first," he said. "People talk about that place, say they see things, tracks that don't make sense, things moving in the woods." I asked if he had ever seen anything. He just shook his head. "Not me," he said, "but I never stayed there alone. I don't know who or what was out there, but I do know one thing. I'll never go back." I had been driving for hours when I finally saw the turnoff. The dirt road was barely noticeable in the fading daylight, hidden between thick trees that had crept in over time. I almost missed it, but my GPS had warned me a few hundred feet ahead. I turned onto the path, my tires crunching over gravel, dust kicking up in the glow of my headlights. The cabin was a good 6 miles in, deep in the woods. The rental listing had called it a secluded getaway, perfect for peace and quiet. That was exactly what I needed. Work had been killing me, and I couldn't handle another week of the city. My mind was restless, and I had been feeling like I was on the edge of something. Burnout, maybe, or worse. I had to get out, just for a few days. The drive up to the cabin was slow. The road was uneven, full of potholes and tree roots pushing up through the dirt. I had to keep a steady grip on the wheel to avoid losing control. The trees pressed in close on both sides, branches reaching overhead, blocking out most of the remaining light. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No distant hum of traffic, no background city noise. just the sound of my tires and the occasional rustle in the undergrowth. When I finally saw the cabin, relief washed over me. It was small but sturdy, with dark wooden walls and a stone chimney. A single porch light flickered weakly above the door. I parked in front, cutting the engine, and just sat there for a moment, enjoying the stillness. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine. I hadn't seen another house or even a sign of people since I left the main road. I grabbed my bag and stepped out. The temperature had dropped, and I could see my breath in the air. The wind had picked up, whispering through the trees, making the branches sway. I made my way up the short steps to the door, fishing the key from my pocket. It was an old-fashioned metal key, heavy in my hand. Inside, the cabin was simple. A small living room with a couch and a stone fireplace, a kitchenette, a single bedroom with a thick quilt covering the bed. It smelled like wood and dust, like no one had been here for a while. I set my bag down and checked my phone. No service. That didn't surprise me. The listing had mentioned the lack of reception, which I had actually looked forward to. A forced break from emails and social media. But now, standing alone in the quiet cabin, it felt different. I felt cut off. I shook it off and started settling in. I unpacked, checked the kitchen, some canned goods, coffee, a few bottles of water, and made sure the fireplace worked. I had brought enough supplies for a few days, snacks, instant meals, a couple of books. Nothing fancy. I was here to relax. By the time I was done, it was fully dark outside. The cabin had only a few small windows, and the trees made it feel even more closed in. I turned on a couple of lamps, their yellow light barely reaching the corners of the room. I wasn't tired yet, so I made a cup of coffee and sat by the fire, listening to the wind outside. It was peaceful, for a while. Then I heard something, a soft, rhythmic sound, just outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was the wind, the trees swaying, branches knocking together. But this was different, more deliberate, a slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. I sat up, my cup halfway to my lips. My heart picked up a little. I listened, holding my breath. The sound stopped. I waited, staring at the door. Nothing, just the wind again. I shook my head, laughing a little at myself. It was probably an animal, a deer or a raccoon moving through the underbrush. I wasn't used to being this deep in the woods. Every little noise felt bigger, more unnatural. I finished my coffee and decided to turn in. I double-checked the locks, made sure the fireplace was safe, then headed to the bedroom. The bed was firm but warm. I pulled the covers over me, letting out a long breath. I woke up to the sound of footsteps, not inside, outside, slow, deliberate, crunching over the gravel near the porch. I went still, barely breathing. My heart pounded in my ears. It was too heavy to be an animal, too slow. I turned my head toward the window. The curtains were thin, but I couldn't see much outside, just darkness and the faint outline of trees swaying in the wind. Then the footsteps stopped, right outside the window. I didn't move. I barely blinked. My fingers gripped the edge of the blanket. Then something tapped against the glass. Soft, light, almost like a fingertip. I sat up fast, my breath caught in my throat. My first thought was that it was a branch. Maybe the wind had blown it against the window. But the night was still. The wind had stopped. I stayed like that for what felt like an hour, staring at the window, waiting for something to move. Nothing did. Eventually, I forced myself to lie back down. I didn't sleep. I just listened, every little creak and shift of the cabin making my skin crawl. Morning came slow, but when the first light finally crept through the windows, I felt like I could breathe again. I got up, moving cautiously to the front door. I hesitated before unlocking it, then stepped outside. The air was cold, the ground damp with morning dew. And there, in the dirt just below my window, were footprints. Not boot prints, bare feet, large, deep in the mud, leading from the trees, right up to the cabin, then back again. I stared at them, my stomach twisting. My first thought was to grab my phone, but I already knew no service. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. Nothing. Just endless forest, quiet and empty. But someone had been here, standing just outside my window, watching, listening. I didn't waste time. I grabbed my bag, threw everything into it, and locked the cabin behind me. I didn't look back. The drive back to the main road felt longer than before. Every shadow between the trees looked like a person. Every fallen branch made me jump. When I finally saw pavement again, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I didn't tell anyone. What would I even say? That I heard something? That I saw footprints? Sounded crazy, even to me. But I know what I saw. Someone had been there, watching, and they let me know it. I should have never gone up there alone. The cabin sat deep in the woods, far from any town or road, miles away from the nearest neighbor. It was my uncle's place, a rundown hunting cabin he never used anymore. It had been years since anyone had stayed in it, but he let me borrow it for a weekend. I needed the space. I wanted to be away from everything. The drive out there was rough. The dirt roads twisted through miles of thick forest, uneven and rutted from years of heavy rain. My truck bounced over deep potholes, the tires kicking up dust. The trees grew so close to the road that branches scraped against the windows. I lost signal about 10 miles back, but I wasn't worried. I had brought plenty of supplies, food, water, a rifle just in case. I planned to spend a couple of days hiking, reading, maybe hunting. Just me and the woods. The cabin was smaller than I remembered, just a single room with a loft overhead. The wooden planks of the porch were soft and warped from rain. A rusted padlock hung from the door, but I had the key. The inside smelled of damp wood and dust, stale and lifeless. There was an old cast iron stove in the corner, a wooden table with one leg slightly shorter than the others, a small cot covered in a thin layer of dirt. I dropped my bags near the door, opened the windows to air the place out, and checked the small generator out back. It was low on gas, but I had extra. It started up on the second pull, a low hum breaking the silence of the woods. That first night was fine. The wind whispered through the trees, and the forest settled into its usual nighttime rhythm. Distant rustling, the occasional snap of a branch, the hoot of an owl. I cooked a can of chili on the stove, read by the dim yellow light of my lantern, and fell asleep early. The cot was uncomfortable, the mattress stiff and musty, but I managed to sleep. The second day I hiked. There were old trails winding through the woods, barely visible under the fallen leaves. I followed one down to a creek, the water clear and cold, flowing lazily over smooth rocks. I found deer tracks in the mud along the bank. The woods felt alive, but in a quiet way, peaceful, the way I wanted them to be. It wasn't until I got back to the cabin that I noticed something was off. The front door was cracked open, just an inch or two. I was sure I had closed it. I never forget things like that. My rifle was still in the truck, so I grabbed a heavy branch off the ground and pushed the door open. Nothing looked disturbed. My bags were where I left them. The windows were still open, curtains shifting with the breeze. Maybe I hadn't latched it properly. I shook it off. That night, I didn't sleep as well. Every small noise outside made me open my eyes, listening. The wind picked up, rattling the loose window panes. I thought I heard something moving through the trees, slow, deliberate footsteps crunching through the leaves. I told myself it was an animal, a deer, a raccoon, something harmless, but I still reached for my rifle and kept it close. The next morning, I found footprints near the cabin. Human footprints. They weren't mine. They were smaller, the treads deeper in the damp earth, circling the cabin. I followed them a few yards into the trees before they disappeared into the undergrowth. Someone had been here walking around while I slept. I thought about packing up, but I convinced myself it was just some hunter passing through. Maybe a local checking out the old cabin, curious about the truck parked outside. I should have left then. That night, I locked the door. I made sure the windows were shut. The generator sputtered and ran low on fuel, and I had to go out back to refill it. I used my flashlight to scan the trees as I worked, but I didn't see anything, just the empty forest. When I went back inside, the lantern on the table was gone. I searched the whole cabin. I checked under the cot, in the loft, even outside on the porch. It wasn't there. I was sure I had left it on the table. The only thing left was a faint scuff mark on the wood, as if someone had dragged it off the edge. I slept with my rifle in my hands, or at least I tried to sleep. Every sound made my muscles tense. I kept picturing someone standing just outside the window, watching. I wanted to believe it was my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew I wasn't alone. I didn't make it through the night. At some point, I heard it. A slow creak of the floorboards outside, the unmistakable sound of weight shifting on wood. I held my breath, gripped the rifle tighter. The footsteps stopped. For a long time, there was nothing but silence. And then the doorknob turned. I jumped up and flicked on my flashlight, aiming it at the door. The knob twisted, but the lock held. I didn't move. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. Then, without warning, there was a single knock. Just one. Slow. Deliberate. I shouted, told whoever it was to leave. My voice cracked. No answer. Just silence. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. My hands ached from gripping the rifle so tight. Then, I heard footsteps moving away. At dawn, I packed my things. I didn't bother making breakfast, didn't even shut the windows. I grabbed my bags and left. When I got to my truck, I saw them, more footprints circling it. The dirt near my tires was disturbed, like someone had crouched there for hours, watching. I drove out of those woods and never looked back. I don't know who was out there, and I don't want to know. I never told my uncle what happened, just handed him back the keys, said thanks, and never mentioned the cabin again. I don't think he's been back since. I hope he never does. I drove up the narrow, winding road, my headlights slicing through the thick fog that clung to the trees like a living thing. The cabin sat deep in the woods, far from the town, far from people. That was what I wanted. That was why I rented it. I needed to be alone, away from everything, away from the noise and the mess of my life. Just a weekend, just some time to clear my head. The gravel under my tires crunched as I pulled up in front of the cabin. It was smaller than I had expected, a single-story structure with a slanted roof and dark wood siding. The windows were black, reflecting nothing, as if the cabin itself had no soul. The porch creaked under my boots as I stepped up to the door. I fumbled with the keys, my fingers cold despite my gloves. And when the door finally swung open, the smell of dust and wood greeted me. Inside, the cabin was simple. Just a couch, a coffee table, a fireplace, and a tiny kitchen tucked into the corner. A single hallway led to the bedroom and the bathroom. The walls were bare except for a single framed photo hanging by the fireplace. It showed the cabin as it must have looked years ago, newer, brighter. But it wasn't the cabin that caught my attention. It was the figure standing on the porch in the picture. A man, his face blurred, his body turned slightly as if he had been caught mid-step. I stared at it for a long time before shaking it off. Probably just the previous owner. I set my bag down and went to the kitchen, checking the cabinets. There were a few cans of food, some old coffee, and a single bottle of whiskey. I hadn't brought much with me, just enough to get by for the weekend. After making a quick dinner, I settled onto the couch, the fire crackling as I sipped from the whiskey bottle. The silence of the woods pressed in on me, but I liked it. No cars, no voices, no distractions. Just me and the dark. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. The fire had died down, leaving only glowing embers. The cabin was freezing. I sat up, rubbing my hands together, and that's when I heard it. The faint creaking sound, slow, deliberate, came from outside, from the porch. I stayed completely still, my breath held in my chest. The wind? An animal? I told myself it was nothing, but my body didn't believe me. I stood up, moving as quietly as I could, and walked to the window. The porch was empty, nothing but the trees beyond, their branches moving slightly in the wind. I shook my head and turned away, but as I did, something caught my eye. Footprints in the dirt. Not mine, not old, fresh, leading from the trees to my porch. I swallowed hard and checked the door. locked. The windows, locked. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe they were my own footprints from earlier, and I just hadn't noticed. That had to be it. Still, I barely slept the rest of the night. The next morning, I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin. The footprints were still there, leading up to the porch, but now there was something else. Another set of prints, leading away, back into the woods. I crouched down, staring at them. They weren't mine. I hadn't walked into the woods. I felt my stomach tighten. Someone had been here. Someone had stood outside my cabin in the middle of the night, watching. I spent the day trying to shake the feeling off. I went on a short hike, took some photos, tried to enjoy the isolation I had wanted so badly. But every time I looked at the trees, I felt something looking back. A weight, a presence, just out of sight. That night, I locked the door and pushed the couch against it. It was stupid, paranoid, but I did it anyway. I barely touched the whiskey this time, wanting to keep my mind clear. The fire burned low, and I sat in the dark, listening. Then, just past midnight, the creaking started again. Slow, deliberate, the sound of weight shifting on the old wooden boards of the porch. I gripped the arm of the couch, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then came another sound. The doorknob, turning, testing. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The door was locked. The couch was heavy, but I felt no comfort in that. The knob turned again, harder this time, rattling against the lock. Then silence. I strained my ears, trying to pick up any sound, any clue that the person was still there. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. Nothing. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. When I woke up, sunlight streamed through the windows. I rushed to the door, my hands shaking as I moved the couch away and unbolted the lock. I stepped outside and my stomach dropped. The footprints were there again. But this time, they didn't just stop at the porch. They circled the cabin, around and around. I packed my bag in minutes. I didn't care about the rental agreement. I didn't care about my weekend away. I threw my stuff in the car and sped down the winding road, my hands gripping the wheels so tightly they ached. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back in town, surrounded by people, by noise, by life. Days later, I got a call from the rental owner. He asked why I had left so suddenly. I told him someone had been there, watching me, testing the door, walking around the cabin. He was quiet for a long time before he finally spoke. "You're not the first one to leave early," he said. I never asked what he meant. I didn't want to know.